If folks could take their seats, we're getting ready to start. Good. Know who those people are. We're now in session and on agenda item 28 and following 28 we will be taking up agenda item 18. At this time the board will hear a staff presentation and receive comments on a proposed Basin Plan amendment and TMDL for control of pyrethroid pesticide discharges. Today the board is receiving comments on the proposed amendments. At the 2017 board meeting, at the June 2017 board meeting, the board will consider adoption of the amendments. Should staff propose significant changes, perhaps in response to the comments received here today, the board may reopen the hearing in June to receive additional comments on those proposed changes. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. At this time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, I do. Thank you. Following the staff presentation, interested parties will then be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board, and a timer will be used. And I should say at this time, we'd appreciate cards. If you have not submitted your card and you expect to testify, please complete a card and return it to Corinne Lanfranchi Rizzardi right here, this great lady right here. Thank you. And as I said, following the staff presentation, interested parties will then be allowed 3 minutes each to address the board. A timer naturally will be used. Please state your name, address, affiliation, and whether you've taken the oath before you testify. And then I'm ready to ask, does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
No legal issues.
I'm never sure who to look at. Very good. We will now begin with a staff presentation. After the staff presentation, there will be presentations by the Pyrethroid Working Group panel, 15 minutes, the agency and researcher panel, 10 minutes, the City of Roseville and Port of Stockton, 5 minutes. Very good.
Okay, good afternoon, Chair Longley and board members. My name is Tessa Foget, and I'm an environmental scientist in the Pesticide TMDL unit in Sacramento, and I have taken the oath. Today I'll be speaking about the Central Valley Pyrethroid Pesticides Total Maximum Daily Load and Basin Plan Amendment. I'd like to start with why we are here today. We know that pyrethroids are widely used pesticides, and there are documented water quality impairments based on toxicity that is linked to pyrethroids. Staff has developed a proposed Basin Plan amendment, and the overall purpose is to establish clear requirements for the control of pyrethroid discharges to provide reasonable protection of beneficial uses in the project area, which is the entire Sacramento and San Joaquin River watersheds shown on the map. Today I will present the proposed Basin Plan amendment to the board, and we will hear comments from stakeholders on the proposal and receive feedback from the board. Because this project is complex, we've had 3 previous workshops so that we could get feedback from the board as we were developing the proposal. These workshops covered key issues and challenges with the Pyrethroids Control Program, potential regulatory approaches, monitoring needs and challenges, and a straw man proposal of the potential regulatory approach. Following the August workshop, staff completed a draft proposed Basin Plan amendment and supporting staff report, which were released in January. Today, we are presenting the proposed Basin Plan amendment and hearing comments from stakeholders and feedback from the board. But we're not asking the board to take any action on the proposal today. After today's hearing, staff will prepare responses to the comments we receive, including any appropriate changes to the draft proposal. And then we are planning to come back to the board in June to request that the board consider adoption of a proposed Basin Plan amendment. This hearing will begin with a staff presentation, and I'll start with background information on pyrethroids and an overview of the program and its goals. Next, I will cover the proposed concentration goals, and I will spend a lot of time on this topic because it is complex and one of the more contentious issues for stakeholders. Finally, I will present the proposed regulatory approach and conclusions. The information I will present is summarized from the draft staff report, which is part of your agenda packet. Following the staff presentation, we will open it up for public comments and discussion with the board. I will begin with some background on pyrethroids. Pyrethroids are commonly used pesticides that have significant use in agriculture as well as urban and residential areas. In urban areas, both commercial applicators and homeowners apply these pesticides. There are several identified sources to surface waters, with the main two being urban stormwater runoff and agricultural runoff. In addition, pyrethroids have been detected in municipal wastewater effluents. It is important to point out that pyrethroids are valuable tools for both crop protection and structural protection, and are less toxic to humans than older products like chlorpyrifos and diazinon. Pyrethroids are a concern in water because they are toxic to aquatic organisms at very low concentrations. The aquatic invertebrate Hyalella azteca has been documented to be the most sensitive test organism in the dataset. The LC50s, or the lethal concentration to 50% of the tested population, range from 0.3 to 7 nanograms per liter, which is parts per trillion. This species is a resident in the delta and its tributaries and is a source of food for fish, including the endangered delta smelt. Reproductive effects on fish also occur at very low concentrations and have been documented for salmonids and for the inland silverside, which is also a delta resident. For comparison, these toxic effect levels are approximately 10 to 100 times lower than most other pesticide effects on aquatic organisms. Pyrethroids have been identified as a potential contributor to the declining fish populations in the delta, and this is why adopting a pyrethroids control program was identified in the board's 2014 Delta Strategic Plan as an important project for improving water quality in the delta. Pyrethroid use is split about evenly between agricultural and non-agricultural uses. In the project area, ag crops account for about 47% of pyrethroid use, such as fruit and nut trees, alfalfa, tomatoes, rice, and corn. The non-agricultural uses primarily occur in urban and residential areas and include structural pest control, landscaping, and home and garden uses. Most urban pyrethroids are applied by professional commercial applicators, but a small portion are applied by non-professionals, such as homeowners. This percentage is estimated because the amount applied by non-professionals is not directly reported and tracked. The project is focused on 6 pyrethroids identified as priorities because they have the highest use of all pyrethroids in the project area, and they have all been associated with water quality impairments. This graph shows average annual reported application of pyrethroids in pounds. Some are used primarily for agriculture, denoted by the green bars, and some primarily for non-ag use, urban uses, denoted by the gray bars. Some are used in both types of applications, such as bifenthrin. As you can see, these 6 pyrethroids make up the vast majority of all pyrethroids used in the basins. This graph shows trends in agricultural and non-agricultural use of pyrethroids based on pounds applied in the project area. Ag use is the green line, and non-ag use is the gray dashed line. Both types of uses follow similar trends and vary from 1990 to 2011. Urban use declined in the late 2000s, which we suspect was a result of the nationwide economic recession, because people may have had less money to pay for professional pest control. Urban use increased in 2011, as did the economy. Agricultural use of pyrethroids also saw a spike in 2011 when there was an increase in acres treated for many crops. and it appears that bifenthrin accounts for much of the increase, possibly due to new bifenthrin products being registered. There is a large summary of pyrethroid concentration data in both water and sediments in the staff report. The data is from the SEDEN database, which is the water quality database maintained by State Board for the years 2003 to 2013. We looked at detection frequency as well as exceedance frequency, for which detections were compared to the pyrethroid levels used for the most recent 303D list update. I want to note that for the water samples, the detection limits are above the exceedance level, meaning that some samples where pyrethroids were not detected could actually be exceedances if the analytical chemistry methods were more sensitive. Overall, detections of pyrethroids are more frequent in sediment than in water, and detections are more frequent in urban areas compared to agricultural areas. Urban waters also have higher exceedance frequencies. In both ag and urban areas, bifenthrin has the highest levels of detection frequencies and exceedances in both water and sediment. This is likely because bifenthrin is significantly more persistent than the other pyrethroids, taking longer to degrade in the environment. Based on this data summary, we know that considerable reductions in the levels of pyrethroids in discharges will be needed. Environmental fate of contaminants refers to where these chemicals end up once they enter our waterways. Pyrethroids have a strong tendency to bind to surfaces, including bed sediments, suspended particles, and dissolved organic matter. This means that the majority of pyrethroids in a waterway will be bound to one of these surfaces. And this is why we see more toxicity in sediments than in the water column. While pyrethroids are very toxic in the water column when they are freely dissolved, the overall environmental fate for pyrethroids is that they will end up in the sediments. Once they are bound to sediments, some will slowly release over time back into the water, but some will remain bound to the sediments for longer periods until they are degraded. Pyrethroids are considered moderately persistent because they typically degrade more quickly than DDT and other legacy organochlorine pesticides, but typically do persist for weeks or months at a time in sediments, and in some conditions can be stable for years. In particular, bifenthrin seems to persist significantly longer than the other pyrethroids, typically taking a year or longer for half of it to degrade in sediments. They degrade more quickly. Pyrethroids degrade more quickly in the water column, but as I said, that will only be a small fraction of the pyrethroids. Pyrethroids are not known to move up the food chain and cause toxic effects in animals the way that DDT does. Uptake by animals has been documented, but thus far, no studies indicate that this is causing significant toxic effects up the food chain. There are management practices that are documented to reduce pyrethroids in discharges. In agricultural areas, there are several effective physical best management practices, or BMPs, including source control practices, such as application practices that reduce drift and overspray, and those that reduce or slow runoff and capture sediments. Municipal stormwater and wastewater dischargers are more limited in their controls because they do not have control over use of pesticides by individuals in their service areas. However, they can use education and outreach to encourage reduced and proper pesticide use by residents. Other management practices for urban dischargers are practices that reduce or slow runoff from irrigation or storms, and pollution prevention activities such as using integrated pest management. Features such as constructed water quality treatment ponds can be effective, but these may not be feasible for many existing facilities due to budget and space limitations. While municipal wastewater treatment significantly reduces pyrethroid concentrations, there are no wastewater treatment technologies that are demonstrated to reliably achieve the low pyrethroid concentrations that will likely be needed. Coordination with regulators of pesticide use has been an effective practice because it has encouraged these agencies to look more closely at urban pesticide issues and move toward preventing and mitigating surface water contamination. While we know that all of these management practices are effective, we don't know what degree or extent they would need to be implemented to attain the low levels of pyrethroids that would protect aquatic life. And this uncertainty is what led us to a phased approach for the proposed Basin Plan amendment, which I will discuss next. In the proposed Basin Plan amendment, staff is proposing a comprehensive phased regulatory approach to meet the project objectives. A phased approach is needed for this program because there are several areas of uncertainty and adaptive management will be needed. We know that significant reductions in pyrethroid levels will be needed because pyrethroids are toxic to aquatic life at very low concentrations. But there is uncertainty about the extent of waterways with elevated pyrethroid levels, the attainability of potential concentration goals, and the feasibility and costs of the management practices that would need to be implemented to attain potential concentration goals. In light of these uncertainties, the proposed amendment is a phased approach designed to move toward water quality improvement and ensure data are collected to resolve these uncertainties. The phased approach helps to avoid unintended regulatory consequences, especially for municipal wastewater dischargers, which are a small contributor of pyrethroids but face stricter requirements for meeting water quality objectives. A phased approach also allows the board to revise Basin Plan requirements before the concentration goals would need to be achieved. Now I will go over the project goals and objectives. The overall goal of the program is to establish clear requirements for the control of pyrethroids that provide reasonable protection to beneficial uses in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. The first project objective is to establish measurable pyrethroid concentration goals to provide reasonable protection of beneficial uses. The second objective is to address existing impairments, specifically referring to the pyrethroid impairments on the 303D list. And the third objective is to develop reasonable and attainable implementation provisions to achieve the concentration goals. We identified several additional objectives that are forward-looking. These include an efficient process to address future impairments, and including provisions for addressing alternative and replacement pesticides that people may shift to if they decide to stop using pyrethroids. And finally, having a phased and comprehensive program that significantly improves water quality includes gathering the information needed to resolve the uncertainties and avoids unintended regulatory consequences. This is a brief overview of the regulatory program that is designed to meet the project objectives. There are four main components of the approach. The first component is addressing impaired waters through total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, to address impairments in urban water bodies. And using our existing irrigated lands regulatory program requirements to address impairments in agricultural waters as an alternative to TMDLs, called Integrated Report Category 4B demonstrations. The second component is a conditional prohibition of pyrethroid discharges to water bodies with aquatic life beneficial uses in the project area. The third component is monitoring and data gathering to inform the board's future actions. And the final component is coordination with and recommendations for the Department of Pesticide Regulation, or DPR, and U.S. EPA Office of Pesticide Programs, the agencies that regulate pesticide use. Now that I have given an overview of the project and the objectives, I will discuss concentration goals. As I mentioned earlier, establishing pyrethroid concentration goals is a complex and contentious issue, so I'll present a lot of information on this topic. As we began developing this project, we realized that we have insufficient information to propose adopting water quality objectives because the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act requires that the board consider attainability and costs when adopting water quality objectives. And we don't have sufficient data to do a thorough evaluation of those two factors. Because of this, we aim to recommend concentration goals that are expected to provide reasonable protection of aquatic life beneficial uses in the first phase of the program, with the knowledge that we need more information on attainability and costs to actually determine a level of reasonable protection. These concentration goals would serve as TMDL numeric targets and as trigger values under the conditional prohibition. In order to recommend a set of concentration goals, We started with 12 possible alternatives and evaluated them based on the project objectives. This evaluation led us to water quality criteria derived using the UC Davis method. Like other criteria derivation methods, the UC Davis method uses laboratory toxicity data for a range of species to generate a statistical distribution of the concentrations at which toxicity is observed, called a species sensitivity distribution. This is an example of a species sensitivity distribution for the pyrethroid lambda cyhalothrin. Each circle represents an acute toxicity value for a different species, and these are typically LC50s, which again is the lethal concentration to 50% of the test organisms. And we have concentration on the x-axis with a log scale and cumulative probability on the y-axis, which is a way of distributing the toxicity values from 0 to 1. On this graph, species that are further to the left are more sensitive to the chemical, and those further up and to the right are more tolerant, meaning those far on the left experience toxic effects at lower concentrations than those to the right. For this pyrethroid, data were available for 20 species. For all 6 of the pyrethroids, it ranged from 8 to 20 species. The UC Davis method recommends using the 5th percentile of the distribution to calculate the water quality criteria, because the 5th percentile is likely to be below toxic concentrations for the tested species. And on the scale from 0 to 1, this is the lower 5% of the distribution, which is that curved line.
What is the detection limit that we're talking about for this, for these pyrethroids?
So in these type of controlled laboratory tests,
I recognize the dilution and all that, but for a real-world situation, what is the detection limit?
it's often, well, the reporting limit, or that limit of quantitation is often 1 nanogram per liter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Which is 0.001, am I correct?
Yes. Yes. But when you have a controlled laboratory sample like this, you can often detect at a lower concentration because you don't have the environmental matrix.
Interferences, right.
Yeah. So these were, even though that is a very low concentration, it was detected and measured.
No, I'm just thinking about application in
Yeah.
the real world.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so if the 5th percentile criterion is not protective of the most sensitive species in the data set, then the UC Davis method recommends that the 1st percentile is used. Uh-oh. There we go. So as you can see, there is 1 species below the 5th percentile. And for 5 of the 6 pyrethroids, the 5th percentile criteria were above the LC50 for the most sensitive species. And in all cases, the most sensitive species was Hyalella azteca. We had the 1st and 5th percentile criteria peer-reviewed, and 2 of 3 peer reviewers thought that using the 1st percentile criteria as our concentration goals may be overprotective. In response to the peer review, we developed a 3rd option to evaluate the 2.5 percentile. From these percentiles on the graph, the acute criteria is calculated as the percentile divided by 2, because those are LC50s, which is a significantly toxic level, and the criteria are intended to be at a level where significant toxic effects wouldn't occur. Chronic criteria are calculated as the percentile divided by an acute to chronic ratio as a translator from acute to chronic levels, because so few chronic test data are available. We focused our evaluation on the 2.5 and 5th percentile values, and the staff recommendation for the concentration goals is the 5th percentile criteria. If we compare these criteria to the 96-hour Hyalella azteca LC50s, which was the most sensitive species in the data sets, we see that the acute 5th percentile UC Davis criteria are slightly above the LC50s, and the chronic 5th percentile criteria are below the LC50s for all but lambda cyhalothrin, which is equal to the LC50. Both the acute and chronic 2.5 percentile criteria are all below those LC50s. Staff considered both technical and policy issues to arrive at our 5th percentile recommendation for the concentration goals. I will briefly go over each of the different topics we considered. The 5 technical concentrations included conservative factors of the UC Davis criteria, reduced bioavailability of pyrethroids bound to suspended particles and dissolved organic matter, additive toxicity of pyrethroids and toxicity of mixtures with other constituents, temperature effects on toxicity, and sensitivity of various species to pyrethroids. The policy issues that were considered included the regulatory use of criteria, attainability of the concentration goals and the cost of attainment, availability of analytical methods with detection limits below the concentration goals, and the potential impacts if pesticide users switch from using pyrethroids to different products. Next, I will discuss each of the considerations for determining the recommended concentration goals. There are some conservative assumptions in the UC Davis method, particularly the averaging periods and the exceedance frequency of the criteria. The averaging periods mean that if there are multiple samples in a short time period, the sample concentrations would be averaged before comparing to the criteria. However, the averaging periods for the acute and chronic criteria are considerably shorter than the test durations of the toxicity tests that were used to derive the criteria. This is conservative because typically the longer an organism is exposed to a chemical, the lower the toxic concentration is. The UC Davis method also includes an exceedance frequency of not more than once every 3 years, meaning that a single exceedance of the concentration goal in a 3-year period would be allowed, but 2 or more exceedances in that period would not. This is conservative because most ecosystem recovery studies show that recovery occurs in a much shorter time period, several weeks. This is set at 3 years because some long-lived species can take longer to recover. The averaging periods and exceedance frequency of the UC Davis method are the same as those given in the US EPA guidelines for deriving aquatic life criteria. There are also other conservative factors in the UC Davis method because it is designed to be protective, particularly in the absence of large toxicity data sets. Bioavailability is the concept that pyrethroids bound to suspended solids or to dissolved organic matter have a much smaller toxic effect on aquatic organisms compared to pyrethroids that are freely dissolved. In the picture, the large circle contains the total or whole water pyrethroid concentration in a water sample. Pyrethroids are represented by red circles, and only a small fraction is freely dissolved, typically 1 to 30% of the total. The remaining pyrethroids are bound to the solids. Studies have shown that for pyrethroids, the freely dissolved concentration best correlates with toxicity. Staff recommends accounting for the reduced bioavailability when comparing monitoring data to the concentration goals for a more accurate comparison. This recommendation was supported by the peer review of our proposal. It is not currently feasible to directly measure the freely dissolved pyrethroid concentration in commercial labs, although that may be possible in several years. Until this is feasible, staff is recommending that the freely dissolved pyrethroid concentration is calculated using an equation based on the measured total pyrethroid concentration, the dissolved and particulate organic carbon concentrations in a given sample. We also need to consider protection of benthic or sediment-dwelling organisms because the pyrethroids bound to particles will eventually settle out to the bed sediments, and we know that pyrethroid sediment toxicity is a problem. Equilibrium partitioning calculations indicate that attainment of either the 2.5 or 5th percentile UCD criteria in the water would also likely resolve most of the sediment toxicity because sediment concentrations would also be reduced. When considering the levels of the concentration goals, we want to provide reasonable protection for species in the project area and also consider that test organisms are surrogates for the many species residing in the basins that have not been tested and that not all documented effects are accounted for in criteria. We know that Hyalella azteca is the most sensitive species that has been tested, but there are other sensitive species that reside in the project area, such as the estuarine mysid shrimp, Americamyces bahia, and the inland silverside, although Hyalella are several-fold more sensitive than these species. Not all sublethal effects are accounted for in the criteria because the criteria focuses on standard endpoints such as survival, growth, and reproduction. For example, olfactory inhibition in salmonids and reduced resistance to viruses in fish have been documented but were not included in the criteria. The consideration of sensitive species and sublethal effects needs to be balanced by other conservative factors in the concentration goals to provide a margin of safety. Now I will cover the policy considerations. The concentration goals are proposed for use as prohibition triggers and TMDL targets, both of which apply at the point of discharge. Additional dilution will likely be available in most receiving waters. Therefore, pyrethroid levels in receiving waters will likely be lower than the concentration goals, which provides an additional margin of safety. As I mentioned earlier, we have insufficient information on attainability and costs to do a thorough evaluation of these factors, but we did do calculations for these factors with the little data we had available. There is uncertainty in the degree of reductions needed, particularly because almost all of the data we have on concentrations is based on whole water instead of dissolved concentrations. Based on the whole water data, discharge concentrations would need to be reduced over 90% in many water bodies to achieve either the 2.5 or 5th percentile criteria. The reductions needed may not be as large if we look at dissolved concentrations. Attaining concentration goals based on the 2.5 percentile criteria would likely require larger reductions than attaining the 5th percentile criteria, and likewise would be more costly as dischargers would need to implement practices to reduce concentrations. Because pyrethroids are toxic at very low levels, we need analytical detection and reporting limits that are very low to know if dischargers are achieving the concentration goals. Reporting limits for commercial analytical methods are currently close to the 5th percentile levels, but are above the 2.5 percentile criteria. Analytical methods for pyrethroids are continuing to be developed and improved, as was discussed at the board workshop last June. The goal of this program is to both encourage and require that dischargers reduce the levels of pyrethroids in their discharges. However, we do not want to be overly conservative in requirements for pyrethroids, as that would have more potential to encourage pesticide users to switch to different products. Alternative pesticides may also have adverse effects on aquatic life and may not have specific water quality regulations, and we may have even less information about them.
I keep bringing this up, and I apologize for that, but I think for the benefit of everybody, you need to define reporting limits and what constitutes a reporting limit as opposed to a detection.
Sure. So method detection limits in analytical chemistry are usually the lowest level that can be where you can detect that compound, whereas the reporting limit, you want more certainty, and so it's usually a factor of 3 or a factor of 10 higher than that detection limit so that you don't have as much noise in the data and you can be sure of that.
Doesn't it typically run around 95% certainty?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. In summary, we recommend accounting for both bioavailability and additive toxicity in the criteria for the most accurate estimate of the potential toxicity in a sample. The conservative factors in the UC Davis method provide some balance for the factors that were not accounted for due to insufficient information. And the potential dilution available in receiving waters provides some margin of safety to add to this balancing. A key point is that attaining these concentration goals would result in a significant reduction in pyrethroid concentrations and a significant improvement in water quality, since these levels are well below current concentrations in impaired waters. We also considered the concentration goals in combination with the overall regulatory approach to determine what values may provide reasonable protection of beneficial uses. And because this is a phased approach, the concentration goals may be adjusted in the future if the monitoring data indicate that lower levels are needed for protection of beneficial uses. I think I missed talking about temperature effects. Okay, I was just thinking, where's my pretty thermometers? Okay, I'm gonna go back to temperature effects because that is important. So pyrethroid toxicity is dependent on water temperature, and pyrethroids have been demonstrated to be 2 to 3 times more toxic at 15 degrees Celsius compared to standard test temperatures of 23. Most toxicity test data are based on tests at 20 to 25 degrees C, while ambient water temperatures in the Central Valley in winter are closer to 15, but can range up to 30 in summertime. At 30 degrees C, toxicity would likely be lower, but this has never been tested. Temperature effects are not accounted for in the UC Davis criteria because they were not adequately quantified across multiple species. So the toxic potential of pyrethroids during winter storms may be greater than assumed in the criteria, but it may be less than assumed in warmer waters in the summer. Okay, hopefully that's all I missed. So just to summarize the concentration goals, the staff recommendation is the 5th percentile UC Davis criteria with adjustments for bioavailability and additive toxicity. The 5th percentile is consistent with the US EPA guidelines for deriving criteria and the peer review of our proposal. And I'll now pause for any questions on concentration goals. Sure.
I had a question, Carl. I'm interested in this a little bit. You commented that it's not known to cause toxic effects up the food chain, and I don't know. Is that just a lack of study, or is that what are the indicators? And then that kind of makes me wonder what the absorption, how pyrethroids are absorbed by these animals.
So there has been some study on it. So there is some uptake, but pyrethroids are much more readily metabolized compared to some of the older pesticides. So there was a recent study that just came out where there was some, buildup of pyrethroids in small fish eating invertebrates, but it so far hasn't been shown to have really negative effects up the food chain.
So larger animals that might. They're bigger, so it doesn't have as much impact, and they metabolize it fairly rapidly. So
yeah, and mammals are very good at metabolizing them compared to fish or invertebrates. So
I was thinking
or
of the
birds
invertebrates or the fish as the animals. Sorry.
Yeah.
I could be more specific, I suppose.
How far up the food chain are we going?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that kind of brings up in a phased approach. Usually, you're looking at what kind of studies will provide you more information. And some studies in these areas might be a part of that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the temperature effect is counterintuitive. Everything I'm familiar with, metabolic rate tends to be a function of temperature to some degree, dependent upon the species. But you would expect that you would see, at least I would suspect you would see a greater impact at lower concentration, warmer temperatures. And this issue that you're talking about, colder water, it could be more toxic, is kind of intriguing. I just wonder what the mechanisms are on that.
Yeah, so I think it actually is about metabolism, that the organisms at colder temperatures, because they're cold-blooded organisms, their metabolism is slowed down, and so the pyrethroids are in their system longer.
And are not degraded as rapidly.
Right,
That makes
and they're not
sense. That makes sense.
Is there a dilution effect or you just have more storm runoff with? Does the pyrethroid concentrations in the water column increase with winter flows, or do they get diluted and decrease? Or
No,
doesn't
we
matter in this regulatory scheme?
in winter, in storm runoff, that is when we really see the highest levels
That's
of
the highest
pyrethroids.
levels,
Yeah.
because of urban runoff.
I mean, this
But-
year
but
there may be
that's-
some dilution, but
But
in
that's
most
an
years-
effective concentration. And so I guess I would pursue that if we have runoff and we have a concentration which is decreased by a factor of 2, even a factor of 7 or 8, I would expect to see less effect. Would that be appropriate? Your concentration's gone down because of the dilution.
Yeah.
So are you going to be seeing an increased effect from pyrethroids at a lower concentration? And we're being very unspecific, non-specific here in the discussion, because if you're going to talk about that, you're going to have to talk about absolute temperatures and absolute concentrations, but
So, I mean, the concentration, or the toxicity is directly a function of the concentration, especially when adjusted for bioavailability. So, to a certain extent, as the storm water runoff comes off, we'll see an increase in concentrations, but if it's a massive storm and there's a ton of dilution, of course, we'll see less. So, probably
and-
okay this year.
So the toxicity is related to the free pyrethroids in the water column.
Correct.
And I'm still, what's the mechanism for uptake? Are they just breathing through their gills and?
Yeah, so it may just be coming in through their gills, but there are, like, the sediment-dwelling organisms
They
that
have-
may also ingest particles that have pyrethroids.
Yeah, that would make sense.
And so that could also be an exposure route.
And I do appreciate your discussion. I had questions about that, and I appreciate your further discussion on how you got to the 5th percentile, and this makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on concentration goals, or?
I guess I'm
Sure.
going to be concerned about analysis and cost and things like that, and how it affects the decision, the ultimate decision. But
Yeah.
I appreciate that you addressed that. You acknowledge that it's early and that detection limits are different in sort of the commercial world versus a lab, and so I can imagine that that's maybe something that'll be developed as this goes forward.
With the detection limit issues, or?
No, just with the cost and, availability
Oh.
of labs to handle this kind of data
Yeah.
and get real results, and
Yeah,
how we handle, who the regulated parties are going to be, and the ability of the regulated parties to actually control the outcome when there's such a large other part of maybe users that we can't really address.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah.
tricky too.
yeah, and I think I'll get into that in the regulatory approach of those factors.
And appreciate the sort of a review and sort of status update. And I know we did a big sort of deep dive last time on the percentile issue, and I think the board, I don't know if it was a solid direction, but it was a sort of a tacit approval of the 5th percentile, and I think you've shown again that that's probably the right way to go. But just wanted to, so I don't forget to say that. So.
Could I get you to make a comment on the half-life of the pyrethroids in both the water column and the sediment?
Yeah, so as I talked about, so the half-life would be longer in sediment than in the water column. So in the water column, if it's really freely dissolved, we would expect it to get degraded probably in days, a number of days or weeks. But a lot of it, like I said, is going to get absorbed to those particles and then settle out. And so in environmental sampling, we've seen kind of a large range of half-lives, but like I was saying, it's often weeks to months in sediment. And for bifenthrin, in many cases, we've seen it be stable for years. So that bifenthrin particularly is going to have a residual issue.
Yeah, Tess, so you spoke about the conditional prohibition of discharge. When is that applied?
When?
Yes.
So I will get into that, but it's going to be delayed 3 years from approval. But I'll go over that. Okay, so maybe it's time to get into that regulatory approach. So next I will discuss the regulatory approach. And as a reminder, the four main components of this approach are addressing impaired waters, a conditional prohibition, monitoring and data gathering, and coordination with the pesticide regulatory agencies. And next I'll describe each of these in more detail. So the first component, addressing previously identified pyrethroid impaired waters. There are 14 water bodies on the Clean Water Act Section 303D list of impaired waters for pyrethroids, and those are shown as the red lines on the map. For now, we are addressing those that are on the current fully approved 303D list, but new listings such as those approved by this board in December would have coverage under the conditional prohibition. So of the listings we are specifically addressing, 9 of the water bodies have urban stormwater runoff sources of pyrethroids, and 5 have ag runoff sources. Most of the listings are for sediment toxicity associated with pyrethroids, but there were also 2 listings for water column exceedances. The water column listings were based on 1/10 of the lowest LC50 available at that time, which was consistent with the Basin Plan guidance. The Federal Clean Water Act requires that the board establish TMDLs or other pollution control requirements to address 303D listings. The proposed amendment would establish TMDLs for 9 listed urban waters and establish other pollution controls to address the 5 listed ag water bodies. The TMDLs would apply to 9 urban waters that are 303D listed for pyrethroids in Sacramento and Roseville areas, shown in the circle on this map. In these 9 water body segments, the only pyrethroid sources are MS4s, or municipal stormwater entities. And a TMDL is essentially a plan for achieving water quality standards in an impaired water body. EPA requires us to include TMDL numeric targets for the receiving water that would indicate that the receiving water is meeting water quality standards. We are proposing 2 types of numeric targets. 1, water column pyrethroid concentrations that do not exceed the concentration goals. And 2, sediment toxicity measured by a 10-day sediment toxicity test with the organism Hyalella azteca. The water column target combined with the sediment toxicity target will ensure that both water column and benthic organisms are protected. The Clean Water Act requires that we specify TMDL waste load allocations, which we propose to be equal to the numeric targets and be concentration-based for the water column rather than load or mass-based to simplify compliance. For TMDL implementation, water quality-based effluent limits would be in the form of implementing best management practices rather than specified concentrations. The BMPs could be conducted by the MS4 or through regional or statewide programs that are working on urban pesticide reduction, such as State Board's STORMS project, which is the strategy to optimize resource management for stormwater, or CASQUA, the California Stormwater Quality Association. The proposed timeline for achieving the numeric targets of the TMDL is 20 years in order to give enough time to try management practices, see how effective they are, and possibly request more actions from DPR or US EPA. The proposed Basin Plan amendment also includes requirements to support Category 4B demonstrations to cover 5 303D listed ag water bodies. Category 4B is a classification of the Clean Water Act integrated report that refers to water bodies that do not require a TMDL because pollution controls are in place that will result in water quality standards being achieved in a reasonable time period. For this case, we expect the requirements of the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program to result in achieving standards in these water bodies. To strengthen the case for a Category 4B demonstration, there are trigger values and implementation provisions that apply to these water bodies in the proposed Basin Plan amendment. The triggers would be equal to the pyrethroid concentration goals, including the adjustments for bioavailability and additive toxicity. Implementation of the management plans would occur through irrigated lands or other existing regulatory programs. And the timeline to achieve the triggers would be 20 years, which is consistent with the urban TMDLs. I also want to mention that Category 4B demonstrations are subject to EPA approval on a case-by-case basis. So the second regulatory component is establishing a conditional prohibition of discharge of pyrethroids above the concentration goals, which are considered prohibition triggers in this component. The concept of the conditional prohibition is that discharges of pyrethroids above the triggers would be prohibited unless dischargers implement management practices designed to reduce pyrethroid discharges. So the prohibition would not apply to TMDL dischargers because it would be duplicative. These management practices would need to be identified in a management plan, and management plans would be run through our existing programs. We are proposing that the prohibition would go into effect 3 years after approval of the amendment to allow for 2 years of baseline monitoring and 1 year to develop the management plans. The conditional prohibition is aimed at preventing future impairments and addressing pyrethroids comprehensively. To that end, I'd like to point out that the conditional prohibition would apply to all dischargers in the entire Sacramento-San Joaquin River basins, meaning that this is a large-scale program that will affect many dischargers, particularly MS4s, ag dischargers, and publicly owned treatment works, or POTWs, since these have been identified as the main sources of pyrethroids. For both Phase 1 and Phase 2 MS4 dischargers, staff is proposing that the prohibition triggers would apply to the point of discharge. Management plans would be implemented through the MS4 regulatory program, and the management practices would be included in their stormwater management programs. Implementation could occur through a regional or statewide program, such as State Board Storms Project. For POTW dischargers, the prohibition triggers would also apply to the point of discharge. Management plans would be implemented through the NPDES regulatory program, and the management practices would be included in a pollution prevention plan or directly in the permit. The proposed Basin Plan amendment includes language to ensure that the prohibition triggers are not used as effluent limits, because that's not the intention for these numbers. Instead, whole effluent toxicity testing would ensure that aquatic life are protected. Consistent with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, receiving waters could be monitored rather than field discharges for ag waters. The management plans would be implemented through our existing programs, such as Irrigated Lands, and management plans would be implemented by all dischargers represented by the monitoring station if the trigger is exceeded, which is also consistent with the Irrigated Lands Program.
Jess,
Yeah.
can I ask, so can you go back? So if it just got a how would a dairy management plan deal with this? I'm not,
So the reason we mention dairies is that some dairies have crop lands associated with them. So that's the reason why it's not the actual dairy part where this would probably be an issue.
thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so monitoring and data gathering to inform the board's future actions is a key component of the regulatory approach. Pyrethroid and toxicity monitoring would be designed to meet monitoring goals described in the Basin Plan and would be required through 13267 orders, permits, or prohibition conditions in the Basin Plan. The proposed Basin Plan provisions allow and encourage collaborative monitoring as well as representative monitoring so that dischargers may make the best use of limited resources. Staff recommends that monitoring includes water column and sediment chemistry, toxicity testing with Hyalella azteca in both sediment and water, and particulate and dissolved organic carbon, which are needed to look at bioavailability. For dischargers under the prohibition, initial baseline monitoring will serve to characterize the extent to which water bodies may be receiving pyrethroids at levels exceeding the concentration goals. The baseline monitoring results will provide the information needed to determine where implementation of management practices is needed. Trend monitoring will continue in order to track pyrethroid levels over time as management practices are implemented, and data and information will be gathered regarding treatment feasibility, effectiveness of management practices, and costs. The fourth regulatory component is coordination with the agencies with legal authority to regulate pesticide use. Coordination with the pesticide regulation agencies has been recognized as an important component of working on pyrethroids and pesticide issues in general. The Department of Pesticide Regulation and US EPA Office of Pesticide Programs have both taken steps in the last several years to try to reduce the levels of pyrethroids entering surface waters. Particularly for urban dischargers, additional actions by these agencies may be needed to reduce pyrethroid levels below the triggers. And we are proposing to include in the Basin Plan a commitment for the board to coordinate with these agencies, as well as recommendations to these agencies regarding the prevention of pesticide contamination, and encouraging dischargers and agencies to coordinate on these issues. DPR in particular has made great strides in their registration process with the goal of preventing water quality contamination by pesticides. And because of this, we hope that the issues we're seeing with pyrethroids will not be repeated with newer chemicals and products coming on the market. One of the original goals for pyrethroids was to adopt water quality objectives. But after further assessment, we determined that we had insufficient information regarding attainability and costs to evaluate potential objectives, which is required by Port of Cologne. Staff are proposing that the board commit to assessing whether it is appropriate to adopt pyrethroid water quality objectives in 15 years, after we have collected several years of data. Data on effectiveness of management practices will be used in order to do the thorough analysis of attainability and costs that is required when considering adoption of water quality objectives. In addition, we will want to use the data collected to assess the level of protection provided by the 5th percentile UC Davis values. This is a timeline of the milestones for the Pyrethroids Control Program. The milestones for dischargers to impaired waters are in top in orange, and the milestones for dischargers that fall under the prohibition are in the bottom in yellow. These are basically two separate tracks, and a discharger would only follow one of these tracks, so that's why they're shown separately. So for dischargers to waters that we have already identified as impaired by pyrethroids, they would be required to develop a management plan in the first year after the amendment is adopted. And then following that, implement their plan, conduct monitoring, and submit progress reports that summarize their data, what practice they have implemented and are planning to implement. This is an iterative, adaptive management approach that should lead to progress over the timeline. There is a 20-year timeline for attaining water quality standards in the impaired waters, which is a long time, but based on our previous experiences with regulating pesticide discharges, we think it's a reasonable time to achieve the large reductions needed. For dischargers that fall under the conditional prohibition, the process starts with baseline monitoring because we don't currently know exactly where pyrethroids may be exceeding the concentration goals. MS4s, ag dischargers, and POTWs would all be represented in this baseline monitoring so that we can get a better understanding of the extent of elevated pyrethroid levels in the basin. They would have 2 years to complete baseline monitoring, and following that, if pyrethroids are exceeding the concentration goals, then those dischargers would have 1 year to develop a management plan. At 3 years after adoption of the amendment, the conditional prohibition would be in effect. Then dischargers who were above the triggers would be doing the iterative adaptive management of implementing their management plans, monitoring, submitting progress reports, and adapting as needed to continue to reduce pyrethroid levels. For dischargers that are not exceeding the pyrethroid concentration goals in the baseline monitoring, there are no further requirements unless future monitoring indicates otherwise. The board and staff also have a timeline. Staff will be updating the board on the status of the Pyrethroid Control Program every 3 years as part of the triennial review. These updates will inform the board of any progress achieved with the control program and provide information regarding any recommended changes when the board revisits the entire program in 15 years. So the 15-year timeline is proposed so that there is enough time for dischargers to implement practices and hopefully see results, so the board has enough information to base any changes, as well as to be several years prior to the deadline for attaining water quality standards in the impaired waters, so that any needed changes can be made to ensure that deadline is met.
There's nothing being proposed that would limit future action at the 15-year point, right? It's sort of.
No, yeah, and really, when we do those board updates at the triennial review, you know, the board could direct us to take action sooner, or, you know, it's not limited to that 15 years.
If this is like other pesticide programs, I would suspect that if you do see a problem, we'll see you before the triennial review.
Well, yes, that too.
And I wanted to note, in response to Board Member Ramirez's comment or question earlier, the staff report does include an estimation of the costs of all the monitoring and implementation proposed.
So in the development of this proposed Basin Plan amendment, we had extensive collaboration with stakeholders. We held 9 stakeholder meetings in the last few years to share information and proposals and receive feedback. We shared draft amendment language early on in the process, which helped generate constructive feedback and resulted in significant changes to the proposal over the last few years. While we tried to be responsive to as many stakeholder issues as we could within the bounds of the project objectives, we expect that you will hear about any remaining stakeholder concerns following the presentation. And next, I will summarize many of the comments we have received thus far. So the concerns we heard from the regulated community were similar to those from the Pyrethroid Working Group, which is an industry consortium of pyrethroid manufacturers. The main concerns we heard from these stakeholders is that the UC Davis criteria may be overly conservative because there are several safety factors in the method, as I pointed out earlier. There is also a question as to why we were focused on water column concentration goals when more of the pyrethroid issues have been with sediment toxicity. And our response to that is we expect that meeting the water column concentration goals will also resolve the sediment toxicity issues. And there isn't an established technical basis for deriving sediment criteria values like there is for the water column. So the focus for the concentration goals is the water column, where we also have effects. And this reduction will also reduce sediment concentrations. And then we also have sediment toxicity testing to kind of confirm that. So dischargers are also concerned about the uncertainty in the attainability of the proposed concentration goals, because particularly the urban dischargers have limited controls on pesticides, and there's a potential for unintended regulatory consequences. This is a big reason that we proposed a phased approach to address the uncertainties and wait until we have more information before adopting additional regulations. These stakeholders also question the ecological relevance of Hyalella because some field populations are much more tolerant of pyrethroids than the lab populations. Resistant field populations have been documented to have genetic mutations to resist pyrethroids, pretty much as a result of frequent and high exposures to these pesticides. And the concentration goals are intended to protect Hyalella and other organisms that have not been subject to these exposures. We also heard feedback from environmental interests, including environmental and fisheries groups, fish and wildlife agencies, and academic researchers. These stakeholders pointed out that pyrethroids are likely a contributor to adverse effects on delta fish. This was brought up at a previous board workshop, and a stakeholder presented a study that looked at pyrethroid applications and delta flows and found that both factors have likely contributed to the declining fish populations. This study also pointed out that other factors may contribute to the effects, such as reduced habitat and invasive species, but they have not yet looked at these other potential contributors. Stakeholders also brought up that toxic effects of pyrethroids may be underestimated in the proposed concentration goals due to many of the issues I pointed out earlier, such as temperature effects, toxic effects of mixtures with other chemicals, sublethal effects that were not included in criteria derivation, and the fact that the bioavailability calculations may result in underestimated freely dissolved concentrations due to variation in these calculations. In addition, toxicity has been observed in environmental samples below the proposed concentration goals, and this data was presented at a previous board workshop. So this graph shows that same environmental data set as prepared by staff in the appendix of that draft staff report. The red diamonds are samples that were toxic to Hyalella, and the blue squares show non-toxic samples. The additive freely dissolved pyrethroid concentration is on the x-axis, and you can see that as pyrethroid concentration increases going to the right, there are more toxic samples. Because this is environmental data, there could be other constituents that may be contributing to toxicity besides pyrethroids. But we don't know what those constituents may be because full toxicity identification, evaluations, and chemistry were not done on these samples. The vertical line shows where the chronic 5th percentile trigger would be. So samples to the right of that line would be over the trigger, and those on the left would be under the trigger. So these data are useful to look at because this is the type of data we would be collecting in the monitoring program. But these are not the type of data you would use to pick a concentration goal because environmental samples have a lot of variation.
Tessa,
Yeah.
could you just comment that full TIEs weren't done, but that on the partial TIEs that were done so the board members have that information?
Sure. On a lot of these samples, toxicity identification evaluations, several tests were done to look particularly if the toxicity was due to pyrethroids or organophosphate pesticides, which are kind of the two most common pesticide classes. And in many of those cases, it did show that pyrethroids were contributing. So we do believe that a lot of this toxicity is due to pyrethroids, but like I was saying, it's not the data set you would use to pick the concentration goal because they're environmental samples and there's a lot of variation. And to conclude, the proposed approach meets the overall goal of establishing clear requirements for the control of pyrethroid discharges to provide reasonable protection of beneficial uses in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River watersheds. The proposed approach would address our current impairments and put a comprehensive framework in place to address pyrethroids detected above concentration goals and prevent future 303D listings. It also meets the identified implementation needs of a phased approach with implementation based on BMPs and source control and data gathering to further inform the board over time. This approach is compatible with our existing regulatory programs as well as those that are under development and serving our goals such as storms. The use of a conditional prohibition rather than numeric water quality objectives avoids unintended consequences while still protecting beneficial uses. There is some uncertainty in this approach, particularly in the extent of management practices that would need to be implemented to reduce pyrethroid discharges below the concentration goals. And this approach requires data gathering and follow-up, so the board will continue to be updated on the control program for years to come. And finally, I will just go over the project timeline. So the draft staff report, including the substitute environmental documentation required by the California Environmental Quality Act, and the proposed basin plan language were released in January. Following this hearing, written comments on the proposed basin plan language and accompanying staff report are due March 17th. At the June meeting, we will present our responses to comments we receive and then ask the board to consider adopting the basin plan amendment. And this concludes the staff presentation.
Thank you. Questions or comments? Yes, John.
You noted that, I think it was the 4B part had to get approved by EPA. I know we had a discussion, I think, last time, but can you refresh my memory where EPA is on this?
Danny, do you want to speak to that, or,
I can speak to it.
okay, sure.
We've met with EPA, and we still haven't received final comments from them. The comment period's not closed, but we've been working with them, and I think right now I'm optimistic right now that EPA will be at least they seem to be looking favorably on it right now, and only time will tell, unfortunately, when we finally get our comments, but. At first we were working with them, and there was concerns over the 4B and the trigger levels, but I think that we're starting to come together.
And we don't need that approval, quote unquote, approval before we act in June. That would come subsequent to that, right?
That's correct. And the 4B is a little different too. And I'm looking over Jeannie, jump in here if I'm wrong, but the 4Bs would be something that we'd have to demonstrate after the fact. So they wouldn't necessarily disapprove the use of 4B when they approve the Basin Plan amendment for the TMDL. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would
The
actually.
4Bs are acted on every time we do the integrated report. So EPA is approving taking it off the 303D list, essentially.
How do we handle like overlapping jurisdictions, like, the ag people and then the mosquito districts out spraying for mosquitoes? We're talking about pyrethroids just kind of as a generic at this point.
Yeah, so, we do recognize that vector control uses pyrethroids, and there are several other users probably that aren't our main sources. I guess we are kind of relying on our regulatory programs to focus on areas where we know the source is ag, or be able to identify if it's not ag. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that.
And we also should note that the State Water Board has a permit that controls all those vector applications.
Any further questions, comments? Very thorough briefing. I'm sure that by this time next year, we ought to be really up on pyrethroids. Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your work.
If there's no further comments, or we're ready for the Pyrethroid Working Group panel and why they come up and get ready. Let's take a couple of minutes. Let's try to be back here in 3-4 minutes.
No, it's been here for a while.
It's been there for a while. Well, I know they've got the timeline.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how bad of a problem it is.
Well,
I mean, we've got like 15-year timeline on it, I'm thinking,
I don't know that question.
is it a giant, because I don't know, I've seen the data on how many pounds of this stuff, because it's extremely popular as a potent.
Let's ask.
I didn't want to ask publicly, but is this an exploding
How many panel members are we going to have? Just the two of you? Good.
Took it out of the system. To me, that's where research entities do it, just find good replacements.
Thank you.
We're back in session, and we're ready for the Pyrethroid Working Group, Tess Dunham and Michael Johnson. What's that?
You're missing all your women.
Oh, yes.
I think they would like to hear the presentation too.
We'll wait for our other board members.
There might be a line somewhere.
Andrew, would you mind stepping out and seeing if, not ask Stephanie, because. And then, Pamela, I think that since we know we need revenue, I've noticed that Debbie staked out a desk there, and she seems to be working there full-time. I suspect even when the board's not in session. I think you need to give her a rent bill.
Career folks that be here all the time, they know where the plugs are.
That's right.
That's what it's all about, staying charged.
That's right. The rent bill will be equal to what she sucks on power over there. Yeah, that's right. In the airport, you'll see some people. Well, I
just sent her a note.
I think we're going to get started. Go ahead. She'll thank me because she has a long ways to drive.
Thank you, Dr. Longley. Tess Dunham with SOMAC Simmons and Dunn, here today on behalf of the Pyrethroid Working Group. As Tessa mentioned earlier, we are a consortium of the various registrants and manufacturers of the pyrethroid pesticides. And with me today is Dr. Michael Johnson. He'll be taking the heavy lifting on the technical components of it so I don't get myself into trouble. Just for a real quick, as I said, outline, I'm going to be very brief and talk just in general about our impressions with respect to the staff recommendation. Also provide just very briefly some long-term monitoring results that we have for an urban stream that helps to suggest that what's going on with the urban surface water regulations that were adopted in 2012. And then Dr. Johnson's going to take over and talk very specifically about some of the concerns that have been raised by others with respect to impacts to delta fish species and whether the 5th percentile value is an appropriate and conservative numeric trigger. So first, I would say that I want to thank your staff for all of their time and effort and transparency that they have put into this process. They have been very good to work with and very open. We've had lots of meetings. We've had lots of disagreements, but it's always been in a professional manner, and we just really appreciate all the effort that they've put into this to listen to all the stakeholders and try to bring forward to you something that is protective of water quality, but is reflective of the impacts to dischargers and others. And so thanks to all of them for all of their time and efforts. Generally, while we have concerns with respect to the viability of meeting the 5th percentile triggers, we do think that they are appropriate, that they're not being used as water quality objectives. We appreciate that it's being set up to use them as a trigger value at this point in time, over the first phase of this project as additional information is gathered, and we support the approach that they've put forward with respect to the conditional discharge prohibition. I'll let the different discharge community talk about what that means to them. We don't want to talk, on their behalf with that regard, but overall appreciate the overall approach, and that we're not adopting water quality objectives, which we all know can have far different impacts to discharges and others. We do support the use of the 5th percentile numeric trigger values. We think they are appropriate. We also think they're very protective and very conservative in that they will protect aquatic life beneficial uses. We also support the use of the freely dissolved pyrethroid concentrations and the additive concentration goals, considering the nature of pyrethroids. We do believe, though, that additive concentration goal unit is extremely conservative in that you're taking very conservative individual compound values and adding them up together, and so you have a very additive conservative value collectively. The only other thing here, just because I think there's always wonder that since, in July of 2012, the Department of Pesticide Regulation adopted some new urban regulations that control how our professional applicators apply pesticides or pyrethroids and specifically, and it was done after a number of studies that the Pyrethroid Working Group and others put forward. And I think here the PWG has had a very long-term study of Pleasant Grove Creek where we have over a decade of data, which is unusual to have one area where you have that much data over time. And what you can see here is just the data showing that since 2012, when the urban regulations became effective in July, and then they started to be implemented and rolled out and educating the operators, we are seeing a decline in the results with respect to pyrethroids in Pleasant Grove Creek. So, it's not definitive, but it definitely is suggesting that these new urban regulations are having an impact. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Johnson.
All right, good afternoon, Chair Longley and members of the board. My name is Michael Johnson. I'm a consultant working with Pyrethroid Working Group, and I'm here today to talk about some of the evidence that's been put forward by other stakeholders in previous meetings. We're not talking about evidence or information put forward by the staff, but rather by other interested stakeholders. And I'm going to focus on two types of analyses that were put forward, one of which Tessa did mention in her presentation. She had a slide about other stakeholder concerns, one of which was the potential contribution of pyrethroids to the decline of delta fish. I'm going to walk through that. And then also about the conservativeness of the 5% versus the 2.5% versus the 1% targets. So there has been a claim put forward. In fact, there's even been a paper published recently that claims that there is a relationship between the increased use of pyrethroids over the last couple of decades and decline of several species of delta fish. And the analysis that was used to establish or to make that conclusion is called a linear regression analysis. A linear regression analysis in this case was done between two time series of data, and a time series meaning the collection of information continually over a period of time. In this case, it was the abundance of several delta fish species, delta smelt, for example. Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Fish and Wildlife does surveys in the delta every year. And so we've accumulated a time series of that abundance information. And then also the abundance information that is the pyrethroid use over time. And in fact, Tessa showed a slide that showed an increasing use of pyrethroids in both the urban and ag environments over the course of time. The conclusion basically is that the use of a regression analysis to establish a relationship between two time series is inappropriate. And I'm going to show you a couple of quotes by a very prominent biologist and statistician from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service named is Dr. James Nichols. And he says that these types of analyses are unlikely to yield reliable information, reliable knowledge. Reliable knowledge basically meaning information that you can manage on. And there you see a quote from him that basically says that the correlation analysis, regression analysis, and I'm going to show you some pictures here in a couple of slides, is basically inappropriate for this purpose. The analysis that was presented, the results that were presented, also basically ignores a lot of previous research that's been done, some of it using some very, very sophisticated statistical analyses. And finally, that the analyses themselves are internally inconsistent. So here's just another quote from James Nichols. He wrote an entire paper. This is a small section of that paper. We will provide the entire paper on the comments on the staff report, which will be turned in shortly. But basically, the gist of this is that regression analysis is just not the appropriate analysis to use. Okay, the analysis also found, if you look past just the pyrethroid use, there were several results that were not consistent with previous research that was done on this topic. Thompson et al., including some folks from around this region, in 2010, they performed a very sophisticated statistical analysis, which I'm not going to go into. What they found was that the delta smelt and several other pelagic organisms had some slow declines, but they basically bounced around in abundance until about the year 2000 to 2002. And in fact, Thompson pointed to the year 2002, when the 4 species that they looked at all declined precipitously in a single year. Their conclusion was that there was probably a single or a couple of causes that affected all of those species equally. What they found was that water clarity and water exports from the pumps were the primary causes of that decline. And in fact, the more clear the water got and the higher the exports, the lower were the abundances of delta fish. Another study done in 2010 basically found similar results. The internal inconsistencies are also that in some instances, that study, which again is published, found that there are some cases water exports improved the abundance, in this case of delta smelt, and in some cases decreased the abundance, Sacramento splittail. That is already been found not to be true by a number of other research programs, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's biological opinion for delta smelt, which found that exports generally had adverse impacts on all delta fish species. And so here's the set of regression analyses that were presented to you, to the board, in I believe the August workshop. And the internal inconsistencies are, if I can use my pointer here, what was pointed out, I think this is the delta smelt slide, that there was this negative relationship between delta smelt and pyrethroid use. But what they didn't spend a lot of time with was the positive relationship here between pyrethroid use and this is American shad. So in other words, what this says is that as pyrethroid use increases, so does the abundance of American shad. The conclusion from all of this is that regression analysis is basically an inappropriate statistical technique for establishing the relationships between 2 sets of time series data. In this case, it was the pyrethroids and fish abundance.
Michael, isn't the issue, first of all, we're looking at linear regression, but that, quite frankly, when you use any regression, whether it's linear or nonlinear, you're assuming that you have all of the factors that are impacting a particular population. And in these cases, and I think as we've heard previously, we probably don't. Wouldn't that be part of the reason for the lack of, whether it's a linear or nonlinear correlation?
Yes. you can only find a relationship between what you actually have in your model.
And your shad indicates that, the findings on shad indicate that things going on that we don't know about.
That's correct. And the previous research said that there's likely 1 or 2 or 3 causes that are causing all of the declines similarly, because the fish are all occupying the same habitat. They generally eat the same food, and therefore they should be affected equally by the same causes. And in this case, if we assume pyrethroids as a cause, they're not being affected equally.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, the conclusion is that the regression is not the right. Go on, okay. Also, we would like to talk about the 5th percentile values being not protective enough. Perhaps 2.5 would be more appropriate, or 1% would be more appropriate. The staff report indicates 5% is protective. We would agree with that. We're going to go through some lines of evidence about high level being a food source, the species sensitivity distributions, the protectiveness of the 5% value for food sources of the delta fish, and the conservative nature of the 1 in 5%. So this is, again, just a summary of the food items of delta smelt, longfin smelt, and so on. Hyalella azteca was indicated earlier was a food source of these fish. Hyalella azteca is an amphipod, and as you can see, for most of these, if I can get there we go, amphipods are in fact either not food sources or minor food sources. Where it is a major food source, it is not the same amphipod. It's a different species. So, Hyalella azteca may be a food source, but it's not an important food source. This is a species sensitivity distribution. It's a little different than the one that Tessa showed. This one has been standardized so that the most sensitive species, Hyalella azteca, is down here in the bottom left, and all of the other food sources of delta fish are up here to the right. And what this means is that on this curve, you get the relative sensitivity of these fish relative to Hyalella azteca. The two I want to bring your attention to right here is Eurytimera and the Pseudodiaptomus. Those are considered the really important high-quality food sources for delta smelt, and they're about 40 to 60% less sensitive than is Hyalella azteca.
Do those things maybe feed on Hyalella azteca? I mean, is there any relationship going down?
No.
No.
Nope. Okay, so here's a look at all of the sensitivity of all of the species and all of the tests done to date, and I have numbers for each of these. So this is Hyalella azteca. This is the relative sensitivity of all of these other groups. This is let me see, 15 species of crustaceans, 21 species of insects, 24 species of fish, 2 amphibians, and 8 mollusks. So that's a fairly good set of data, but you can see here at the bottom, Hyalella azteca is by far the most sensitive. And finally, I have just a last slide or two here. The 5% trigger values are appropriate because they minimize the number of incorrect results. In this case, Tessa showed a slide here a little bit ago where she had a vertical line and she had some red dots and some bluish dots. What we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the number of incorrect decisions. And there's a test out there called receiver operating characteristics. And because this is the end of a long 2-day meeting, I will not go through the gory mathematical details, but we'll provide those in our comments. It has a long history of use in both human and veterinary medicine. What I did was I took some of the data that Dr. Don Weston provided to the board here, 118 sets of tests of both toxicity analysis and chemistry analyses. And what we found is that the percentage that minimizes the number of incorrect decisions, and I can go into that a little bit later, although I'm out of time, is about 6.4%, which is basically the 5% level. So the 5% level is the trade-off, which makes sort of you sort of balance the number of incorrect decisions versus correct decisions about whether a sample is toxic or not. So the conclusions are that the PWG supports the use of the 5th percentile values as the numeric triggers. We again we support the use of the freely dissolved pyrethroid concentrations, the phased implementation approach. I want to emphasize that the efforts to control sources of pyrethroids in urban streams seems to be working. The use of the 5th percentile values as numeric targets, triggers, is protective of delta fish species. Hyalella is a very sensitive species, and in fact, if you protect Hyalella, you are protecting just about everything else that's important in the delta. And the 1 and 2.5 percentile values would be too conservative. And with that, I'm done. Questions?
Any questions or comments from board members? Thank you for a very straightforward presentation. Thank you. We're ready now for the agency and researcher panel.
Dr. Longley, Stephen Louie from the Department of Fish and Wildlife was not able to make it today, so.
Okay.
Okay, hello, my name is Donald Weston. I'm with the University of California, Berkeley, and I have taken the oath.
Thank you.
Sure. Excuse me. Okay, I want to cover 3 things today. I have about 7, 8 slides or so. I just want to cover 3 topics. One are the trigger levels, or the objectives, the numerical value. Second, the assumptions of bioavailability and the approach used to come up with a freely dissolved fraction, which is being regulated. And then just briefly at the end, a little bit on the timeline that Tessa talked about of when things are going to be re-reviewed and things such as that. Okay, on the values. This data was in one of the slides that Tessa showed, but I've condensed it down. Okay, we've got the 6 pyrethroids there, and then the Hyalella 96-hour LC50. So that's the concentration that will kill half the individuals of Hyalella if you expose them to that concentration in the lab. And it's about, we'll call it half a nanogram per liter. I should mention I've listed 3 other crustaceans, 2 other amphipods and a mysid, which is a shrimp-like sort of thing, that have comparable 96-hour LC50s. Now, they aren't in the database that the staff used because maybe there's sediment concentrations, sediment LC50 data, not water LC50, or they're marine, this is a freshwater effort. So they weren't used in the database, and I have no problem with that, but just recognize there are other species comparably sensitive to Hyalella. Hyalella is not some freak of nature. Other crustaceans, which is the group Hyalella is in, are comparably sensitive. Okay, so that's, again, the concentration that will kill half the animals, half the Hyalella. The acute criteria, if based on the 5th, is shown in the next column over. We're looking around 0.8, 1, 2. So those values are higher than the 96-hour LC50. In other words, you would expect if those values were met, you would think more than half the Hyalella would be killed by those concentrations. The chronic criteria overall tend to be about half the concentration that kills half the Hyalella. The one exception is, if I can find it, cyhalothrin, where the 96-hour LC50 is 0.3 and the chronic criteria is 0.3. So even if we go with the chronic 5th percentile, we are saying we will allow up to 0.3 nanograms per liter, and that is the concentration that would kill half the Hyalella in a toxicity test. So the point I want to make here is that these 5th percentiles are certainly not overly protective. I would say even borderline protective. for Hyalella and other species with comparable sensitivities. So staff considered the first 2.5th and the 5th percentile. They chose the 5th. The staff report does not claim that that protects beneficial uses, only that it provides reasonable protection. And I applaud staff for adding that term. The merits of the more stringent criteria, staff weighed against the cost of implementation, how feasible it was to even attain those lower levels, things such as that. And there are legitimate economic, technological, political considerations beyond toxicology that the board must consider. But I have no problem with that, and I don't envy your responsibility to make those calls. But as a toxicologist, I just want to make sure you're making those calls fully informed with both eyes open. So I want to emphasize that the proposed 5th percentile triggers provide borderline protection. It's right on the edge. As you saw, those numbers are very close to the LC50s. Borderline protection against lethality of aquatic life, and even less so in the winter when most of the stormwater runoff enters the aquatic systems. As Tessa mentioned, pyrethroids get about 3 times more toxic in the winter, so the level of protection they would provide is even reduced. So they are right on the edge. They probably do not protect against more subtle sublethal effects. If they're only barely protecting against lethality, you can assume things like reduced growth, reproductive effects may still remain unprotected. And that these values do not provide the margin of safety the board typically incorporates in water quality regulations. You're right near that LC50. At best, you're about half of it. So again, you guys have to make some tough decisions, and it's not my job to tell you what decisions to make when you get into the economic and feasibility issues. But I just want to make sure you're aware of where these numbers stand from a toxicological standpoint. And then one minor point, I would recommend that the staff report provide some guidance on when acute versus chronic criteria are appropriate and the kind of discharges each would apply to. For example, there's a line in Appendix B that says acute criteria would be appropriate for stormwater runoff. Well, maybe some stormwater runoff events, but we've just had 40 days and 40 nights of stormwater runoff. So that's anything but an acute exposure. Okay, so I personally would like to see more guidance in the staff report on when acute versus a chronic criteria would be applied. Okay, the question on bioavailability, I'm going to go through this quick because I think you've heard it in the past, but basically pyrethroids can be found in any of 3 pools: the portion that's bound to particles, the portion that's stuck onto dissolved organic matter, or the portion that's just freely dissolved. You've got that pyrethroid molecule just floating around. And the pyrethroid molecules can move, that's what those arrows indicate, back and forth between those pools. The staff report assumes that those 2 upper pools are not bioavailable. The assumption is animals can't pick them up. And the report chooses to not regulate those. It says that only the freely dissolved fraction is the bioavailable one and is the only one in need of regulation. It varies, but call it about 5% of the total pyrethroid. So effectively 95% of the pyrethroids, give or take, are considered to be in fractions that are not bioavailable and not subject to the limitations of the staff report. To determine how much pyrethroid is in those pools, you need 2 numbers: the KOC, which determines how much goes between the particles and the freely dissolved, and the KDOC, which determines how much goes between the dissolved organics and the freely dissolved. So those 2 values are really critical. The complication is that those values should really be site-specific. They can vary from sample to sample, from site to site. But you can't reasonably expect dischargers to make measurements of those values in every single sample they collect. They are very sophisticated measurements, only done in a few research labs. So the staff report offers a default value for KOC and KDOC, which the dischargers can use. They say if you don't measure your own, and no one obviously will or can, they can use this number that the report provides. The difficulty with that, first, I want you to be aware that the KOC and KDOC calculations to derive a freely dissolved fraction and regulate only it is not typical. In fact, it's never been done before. I've checked with colleagues in Europe, it's not done there either. So this is the first of its kind. So I want you to be aware that you're going into new ground here. Second, the default KOC and KDOC values the staff report advocates are based on a single industry-funded study that is not publicly available. Third, the KOC and KDOC values are highly variable from sample to sample. Literature would suggest about a 100-fold difference depending on which sample you're working with and what the measured KOC and KDOCs might be. Therefore, if there's a 100-fold difference depending on the nature of that water sample, what are the chances that those default numbers, if applied to some random sample taken in the Central Valley, are accurate of what that KOC and KDOC actually are in that sample? And then finally, to the best of my knowledge, there's never been validation of the technique in a field sample where you would use, you compare the freely dissolved fraction predicted by your KOC, KDOC calculations with the actual measured freely dissolved fraction. You would think that validation would be necessary, but to my knowledge, it's never been done. Yet the TNDL advocates the approach be applied to stormwater samples, POTW effluents, agriculture-affected waterways throughout the Central Valley. To me, that's quite a leap. And then two concerns on a more fundamental level. The non-bioavailable fraction of pyrethroids is not permanent. As I mentioned, they can desorb from the particles and re-enter the freely dissolved pool. Also, the non-bioavailable fraction is not really non-bioavailable. As Tessa mentioned, ingestion of that particle by aquatic life can result in uptake of those particle-bound contaminants. And then finally, to address the timeline issue, I included here a lot of the more significant, I think, scientific findings. Back in 2004, we first discovered widespread pyrethroid toxicity in Region 5 ag sediments. 2005, we found it in urban sediments. 2010, we found it was in water samples, not just the sediments. 2010, POTW, effluent, and on and on and on. In the red arrows, excuse me, Dr. Longley, could I have maybe another 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Thank you. The red arrows are indicated some of the regulatory actions. The regional staff jumped on the 303 delistings quite quick. We first discovered some of these creeks in 2004, and in 2006 they were already 303 delisted. That's great. Then we got the TMDL, which I'm assuming to be 2018. The 2 points that bother me is that 2033 we'll revisit the program 15 years later, and then 2038 the 303 delisted waterways will attain standards. That's 32 years after they were listed. Now, I don't know how these things work, but that strikes me as an awful long time. I'll be amazed if we're still using pyrethroids 32 years from now, frankly. So I would maybe suggest you maybe try to compress that 15-year review period. That's an awful long time to look at an approach that I think is, there are a lot of unknowns, and I think some of the aspects of it are of concern, particularly the bioavailability part. And I think 15 years is a long way to wait to take another look. So.
One slide, go back one slide, please.
Sure.
I was interested in the blue line, 2017, pyrethroids in Hyela can be transferred to fish that eat them.
Right. That gets at a comment Tessa had made about some populations of Hyela that have been routinely exposed to pyrethroids year after year, have actually been genetically altered and have become, they now have a mutation that allows them to tolerate those levels, which you might expect, when you use pyrethroids in an ag field, that pest can become resistant to them. Well, the same thing has happened in some populations of Hyalella that have seen pyrethroids over the years. Now, mind you, pyrethroids are applied terrestrially. If things are working as they should, Hyalella would never even see those things.
This was a study that's...
So the point, I'm sorry, the point is a non-resistant Hyalella, when exposed to pyrethroids, just dies. These resistant Hyalellas don't die. They accumulate higher and higher concentrations in their tissues. We meaning collaborators that I work with, have then fed those resistant Hyalella that are now packed with pyrethroids to fish and have seen the uptake in the fish. So the fact that they're resistant now provides a route for pyrethroids to move from the high
So
level to the fish.
despite the rapidity of the metabolism, this
Right,
can
right.
be
And
uptake through the biological or system.
right, and also
am
I
I
should
trying to say
mention
here?
the metabolites aren't, metabolism isn't necessarily good. Metabolites themselves can be toxic. Endocrine disruption effects, things like that.
I mean, basically, at least in these two steps, it goes up through the food chain.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. The fish will
I
also
just wanted
quickly
to get that
metabolize the
clear now.
pyrethroids that they take up from the hyaloa, but again, the metabolism of them is not necessarily a good thing. The parent pyrethroid won't be there anymore, but there are toxic metabolites that are formed. Okay.
And now, Dr. Weston, correct me if I'm wrong, but
Oh,
we
okay.
they didn't observe any negative effects on the fish other than they knew they were uptaking
They weren't
pyrethroids,
looking for
correct?
negative effects on the fish. They just wanted to see if it was there, and it was.
yeah, I just was, because it seems to me if something's eating something, it's going up through the food chain. So the clarification is that this certainly occurred, but it may not have had any toxic effects on larger species. Is that, thanks. That's kind of a minor little detail, but we got that right. And while I have you, one of the things that I've come to really appreciate in this approach is the phased approach, which allows us to deal with some of the other realities of measurement and economics and the ability to get where we might want to be down the road. So I appreciate the phased approach to accomplish some of those. You're suggesting that perhaps also that approach should be compressed to get to the end point.
15 years is a long time, seems to
Yeah.
me, to re-examine the approach, yes.
Yeah, I might not be here to really look at the results at that point in time.
Yeah.
I know I won't
You
be.
and me both, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay,
So, Doctor,
so
if
we'll
I
meet
could
again in
just- if I could just-
2038, right?
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Dr. Longley, I'm sorry, Dr.
Yes.
Weston.
I'm
I
sorry.
just, I know 15 years sounds like a long time, but in our world, that goes by in a flash. And by the time, and you think of all the other competing requests for monitoring information on everyone we deal with to get this together and staff's time to put it together. Not that it
Well-
can't come back earlier, but we came up with a number that would give
Right,
us enough time
and
to
a
work
case
on
in
it.
point, we're about 14 years in the Irrigated Lands Program.
And I'm not opposed to the longer time frame, with the caveat that our staff, when things are called to their attention, can certainly revisit this in a shorter time frame. So
And they're not sitting around that whole 15 years not looking at it. I mean, it's evolving, and my experience with other programs is that an awful lot of analysis goes on along the way. Sometimes we make course corrections, that sort of thing. Any further questions or comments?
Let me just go back to the recommendation slide that I didn't quite finish
Oh,
before.
go
I
ahead,
was
go ahead and
questioning.
finish it. I thought you were done. This was
No,
your
I'm
recommendation.
sorry.
Let's let him finish up, because we got to move on.
Yes, okay. Okay, be aware the beneficial use protection afforded by this TMDL provides borderline protection from toxicological standpoint. I mentioned greater clarity would be desirable in acute versus chronic criteria when each are applied. In my view, the Achilles heel of TMDL, if challenged, is the approach underlying the freely dissolved fraction calculations. If you choose to pursue this approach, I would recommend immediate investigation of its fundamental assumptions, field validation, and exploration of alternatives, such as 10X or tox testing.
And what is 10X?
It is 10X is a brand name. It is you can buy it from a chemical supplier. It's a jar of like tiny little beads. And it is essentially a pyrethroid sponge. It will quickly soak up pyrethroids and other chemicals like them. So you can take the water sample, add the 10X beads to it. It will immediately remove all the pyrethroid from the freely dissolved fraction. And then if you continue to hold it, say for 24 hours as typical, any pyrethroid that desorbs from the dissolved organic matter or particles and enters the freely dissolved fraction is also soaked up. Then at the end of that 24-hour period, you analyze the 10X to say how much pyrethroid is on it. So it shows you what is, the term is bioaccessible, what an animal could attain within that 24 hours, the freely dissolved fraction plus the desorbable fraction. And so it's sort of the freely dissolved fraction that the staff report advocates, but it's a bit more than that. It recognizes that there can be some desorption from the
But the
particles.
tox testing really gives you direct data.
Both the staff's recommended approach and the 10X are chemical methods that try to predict which samples are going to be toxic. The alternative is just, let's just do tox testing and let the Hyalella, or whatever species we happen to use, be the one that tells us what's bioavailable. And so rather than us trying to do chemistry to predict it, you can simply just measure it. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm done now.
Tox testing is expensive, but I would agree with you. It gives you some real data.
Yeah, but the sophisticated chemistry you're asking to get these detection limits down to, sub part per trillion level, that's not cheap either.
Well,
So-
that's what I'm saying. I'm
Yeah.
very concerned because you end up with a lot of J-flag values that they're junk, quite frankly. Some of them are okay, some of them are absolutely not okay. And it's not just this program. I become very sensitized to that when we were talking about years ago, other chemicals like dioxins that are at very low concentrations and have human health effects. It's an area that is one that we have to be careful about. And having run a chemical lab in the past, I have that sensitivity too. That you get down near the quantitation limit, you're entering a never land.
Yeah, I think getting into the fractions of a part per trillion, the cost of that is probably very comparable to a tox test.
Right. Any further questions or comments? John?
Real quick,
Yeah.
I know we're running long, but on your slides, you noted that we're sort of on the edge with the LC50.
Yeah, you're right around it, yeah.
But, so the question is, it was presented, and how I've heard it before is that number is all sort of conservative numbers sort of added up together. Is that your view as well, that, how do you view the conservative nature of that analysis?
Yeah, I mean, there are some conservative aspects there, but there are also some not conservative aspects. I mentioned the temperature. That triples pyrethroid toxicity, and we're just putting that aside. So maybe we're even being protective in the summer, but we're the third is protective come wintertime, right? So that's a not conservative aspect of it. Also, often when you do these lab tests, you might measure the concentration at the beginning of the test. Those pyrethroids are adsorbing to the glass walls of the beaker. So maybe you say, okay, I started with 3 parts per trillion. Well, by the end of that test, you're down to maybe half a part per trillion. And yet you're saying, well, it's 3 part per trillion, that's the LC50. Well, it's probably a whole lot less because the animals did not see that 3 part per trillion for the entire duration of the test. So yeah, you can say there are a lot of conservative assumptions thrown in, but I can toss out just as many assumptions that work in the opposite direction. The failure to address sublethal effects I mentioned. Right. Okay, you don't kill them, but maybe they can't reproduce. Is that okay? I don't think it is. But the test does not protect against that. Okay.
Could you comment on 1 or 2 research areas you're looking at now for the future?
Me personally, I'm semi-retired, so I am doing a lot more work with the resistant Hyalella. I mentioned that we see some populations that are resistant, and I might add we see them in areas where there's either a lot of agriculture or urban use of pyrethroids. If you look across the top part of the state, where there's not a lot of development, or down that east side, Mono Lake, Mojave Desert, that stretch, those Hyalella are just as sensitive as our lab animals. They haven't seen pyrethroids. They haven't become resistant to them. So I do think that our lab animals are a fair equivalent to pyrethroids Hyalella that haven't been seeing pyrethroids year after year after year and become resistant. So that short answer is that's one of my main areas of research, and I'm also doing a lot of work on Cashtaloo, which is in the Delta near Rio Vista, and it's an area that pyrethroids are entering at toxic concentrations after rainstorms.
Any further questions? Thank you very much, sir.
I have,
Oh, we
not
got
necessarily for you, but
Okay.
a general question is the urban non-regulated use is 4%. And I don't know, that means that they use 4% of the chemicals sold, or
So that was just an approximation based on sales data, that of the total pyrethroid use in our region, 4% is by
The
non-professional
total sales
homeowners.
is to non-professionals.
Yes, so we don't know how,
And
once someone buys it.
what we don't know, or
how
what
much they
is the
use.
correlation, does that mean, but that's 50% of the pollutant factor we're seeing, or is that, it's a lot more than 4%, because it seems to be,
The urban,
yeah, the urban,
right, because there's a lot of professional, commercial applicators.
Yeah,
So
we're
like
assuming they're doing a
Clark
pretty
Pest
good
Control
job.
sprays the outside of your home or something.
yeah.
So we think a lot of it's actually coming from that commercial use.
So, I thought that was, they've taken a lot of best management practices, though, but you still think they're a significant contributor. I'm just wondering if
Yes.
there's an offset, if there is a weighting for the 4% in terms of the pollutant effect. That would be useful information for further research then, because if they're contributing 50% of the problem, then maybe we should be focusing on their use of this particular.
Got it, yeah.
Yes, so, and there are, the PWG mentioned the DPR surface water regulations on the professional, so we are expecting to see the impact from the professional use go down significantly, so that might help elucidate, but,
That
the
helps the overall problem, but
but
this 4% that's unregulated and uncontrolled, I'm just wondering, are they just dumping tons of stuff without any?
I mean, it would depend on the individual, but, that's an area where we may need more help from US EPA and or DPR
Yeah,
in
that's
terms of
what I'm
what's
thinking.
available.
Is that a focus area that helps us do our job? But
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Weston.
Thank you.
Next would be Dave Bedore, representing the city of Roseville and the Port of Stockton. And then I'm going to be calling on Dave Tomeo, the County of Sacramento.
Just getting situated here. All right, good afternoon. My name is Paul Bedore. I'm a scientist with Robertson Bryan Incorporated. I've taken the oath, and I'm providing comments today on behalf of the City of Roseville's wastewater utility and behalf on the Port of Stockton at Phase 1 MS4. And I just wanted to deviate for a moment to respond to some of Dr. Weston's comments and the questions that we had earlier about bioaccumulation of pyrethroids up the food chain, because it's my understanding that you only see effects of bioaccumulated pyrethroids when the exposed organisms lower in the food chain are exposed to concentrations of pyrethroids well above environmentally relevant concentrations. So put those comments into context, and perhaps Dr. Weston could respond to that as well.
We could get into a back and forth and stay here all day. There's an opportunity to provide comments, and what we do welcome is written comments to go into the record. And in a sense, I wish you had done that in the record, but this is in the record we have today. But go ahead with your presentation. We're most interested in what you have to say
Sure.
to us about Port of Stockton and City of Roseville.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. First, we agree with staff's recommendation to utilize the 5th percentile concentration goals to establish the numeric prohibition triggers. This graphic is similar to what you've already seen, and it compares on the y-axis the effect to Hyalella azteca and toxicity tests compared to the bioavailable pyrethroid concentrations on the x-axis. The red points are samples that were toxic, and the blue samples were those that were not toxic. So there are 109 data points here that were put into this plot from the staff report, but we were able to add an additional 30 data points from a study we conducted on behalf of the city of Vacaville. On this slide, you'll now see an orange box. that highlights an area in which only 3% of the variability in the toxicity on the y-axis is explained by the bioavailable pyrethroid concentration on the x-axis. So what this means is that the pyrethroid concentration does not appear to be a driver of toxicity. Although there are some toxic samples in this area, the red dots, we must question the role of pyrethroids in causing the toxicity, because this group of blue data points all along the bottom here highlights the fact that this range of bioavailable pyrethroid concentrations did not cause toxicity in a large number of samples. Outside the orange area to the right, at greater pyrethroid concentrations, the high proportion of toxic samples makes it much more likely that pyrethroids were the cause of some of this toxicity. So now shown on the chart is the 5th percentile trigger. Apologize. And you can see that to the right, which are exceedances of the 5th percentile trigger, we're capturing those data points at which we're much more confident there was pyrethroid toxicity. But yet at the same time, we can see that the 5th percentile trigger does provide a level of protection, conservative protection, because you can see that a number of these non-toxic samples were captured as exceedances above that trigger. For POTWs and MS4s, the pyrethroid triggers apply at the end of pipe, but for agricultural discharges, these triggers apply at the receiving water. We recommend that for both POTWs and MS4, they be provided the ability to comply with these triggers based on receiving water data. The chart here in this figure shows the utility of using receiving water data. It's basically pyrethroid concentrations in samples from effluent and downstream. You can see the green bars, which are the downstream samples in this study for the Vacaville POTW, that the downstream concentrations were always significantly lower than the effluent. And all but one occasion, the downstream samples complied with the trigger. The one sample that didn't comply with the trigger was actually not toxic, which highlights the conservative nature of the 5th percentile.
So in effect, what you're asking for is a mixing zone, am I correct?
The ability to utilize information, yes, from the receiving water to determine if you're actually causing an exceedance in the receiving water.
Thank you.
So yes. So Central Valley MS4s are currently regulated by the regional MS4 permit that was adopted by this board in June 2015. And this permit requires dischargers to prioritize pollutants based on their MS4's contribution to a receiving water impairment, and then it allows for a focused use of resources to address these priorities. The Basin Plan Amendment should follow this same approach. The 5th percentile, oh, man, I apologize, I am having technical difficulties here. So for the port, their pollutant prioritization for their permit references a study by the UC Davis Aquatic Toxicology Lab. This was an intensive one-year study with bi-weekly sample collection at 16 separate Delta monitoring stations for toxicity with testing with Hyalella and pyrethroids measured on toxic samples. The San Joaquin River station nearest to the port, 50 of 50 samples were not toxic to Hyalella azteca, and for the Delta-wide, 745 samples were not toxic out of 752 samples. Thus, the port's local waterways are not impaired with respect to pyrethroid toxicity, regardless if during that time their discharges had exceeded the pyrethroid trigger. So the port should focus their resources on addressing other pollutants. And I'll leave you with these conclusions, which are that the 5th percentile trigger values are conservative and effectively identify cases of pyrethroid impairment. And we recommend that the Basin Plan Amendment be modified such that POTWs and MS4s be permitted to use receiving water data to comply with the Prohibition triggers, which is currently proposed for ag dischargers. So thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Questions or comments? Thank you. And Dr. Weston, there was a comment made about your work. We would appreciate a written reply. Thank you. Dave Tamayo. Following Dave is Linda Dorn.
It's nice to see you're involved in more than just Mercury, Dave. David was at the Delta Tributary Mercury meeting on Tuesday.
I spend a small amount of my time on pesticides. So.
Man of many talents.
My name is Dave Tamayo, and I'm an environmental specialist with the County of Sacramento Stormwater Program, and I have taken the oath today. And one of the things I really want to emphasize is that we greatly appreciate the process that this has gone through, even though it took a long time, and the willingness of your staff to work with us to listen and to really work out the issues that we brought up. And I think that now we have something that we're pretty happy with. So I've got my happy hat on today. Now, the Basin Plan Amendment provisions really sort of balance the requirements that for what MS4s, stormwater programs have to do on their own account. Versus what the actions that really rely on the pesticide regulators. And I think it's really important, a very key provision of this is that the Basin Plan Amendment recognizes the importance of the state and federal regulators in really effectively addressing pesticides. It refers to the State Water Board Storms Program and sort of is we're able to get there because of years of cooperation with DPR, your board, some folks at the State Water Board in Region 2, and demonstrating that that's a viable way to go. And it's also very important that the Basin Plan Amendment recognize the importance of your board's commitment to that approach. So that underlies a lot of activity that is going to be necessary to keep an eye on this, and then also to prevent problems with other pesticides. So it's a very important policy finding that will be established in your Basin Plan Amendment. And then finally, it's very important that the Basin Plan Amendment provides a pathway for monitoring to take place and for our role in monitoring to be coordinated on a regional basis and with the activities of DPR and the water boards and other regulated entities, other MS4s, so that we're not duplicating efforts. We can maximize the usefulness of the data that we produce and that we use our resources efficiently. So those are all the reasons that I have my happy hat on today. Thank you very much.
Questions? Thank you very much. And while Linda's coming up, next person is Jennifer Tierlink.
Good afternoon, Chair Longley, members of the board. My name's Linda Dorn, and I'm an Environmental Program Manager for Regional SAN. And we appreciate the stakeholder process used to develop the Basin Plan Amendment. The workshop seeking board input as it has made understanding the technical issues easier. Regional SAN has always been supportive of using sound science in setting objectives and making management decisions. With that in mind, we caution against the use of correlations as the main line of evidence in making management decisions regarding environmental factors. As the expression goes, correlation is not causation. It is possible for the trend over time of an environmental factor, such as pyrethroid concentrations, to be correlated with the change in the abundance of a species of concern. But for there to be little or no causal relationship between the environmental factor and the species abundance, that can happen. In an environment as complex as the Delta, numerous environmental factors may show trends over time that correlate with changes in the abundance of a given species. Determining which factors or factor may actually be affecting the species requires more extensive study of potential mechanisms by which each factor may influence the species. Thus, correlations alone cannot provide the scientific basis for understanding mechanisms that usually are multifaceted regarding potential impacts to beneficial uses of water. We also support the board's recognition in the Basin Plan Amendment that state and federal pesticide regulators, the California Department of Pesticide Regulation and US EPA Office of Pesticide Programs, must be coordinated with to appropriately prevent pyrethroid impacts in water bodies. And noting that these agencies are already working to address water quality impacts caused by pyrethroids. We encourage the regional board staff to weigh in on US EPA's aquatic risk assessment determinations from pyrethroids as part of the 15-year review cycle for registration of pyrethroids. Lastly, we believe the TMDL Basin Plan Amendment is implementable using the 5th percentile, coupled with the regulatory approach that's been presented, and the current level of analytical capabilities. In defining what constitutes a reliable commercial method for the future, we recommend that multiple labs being able to provide reproducible data as the definition of a reliable commercial method. And again, we want to thank the board staff for the robust stakeholder process used to develop this TMDL Basin Plan Amendment, and we look forward to participating in an open public process in the implementation and reviewing the TMDL. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and I take to heart your comments on stakeholder process. The board has adopted that more wholeheartedly than ever, and I think it's a good way to go. Any questions or comments for Linda?
Thanks.
Thank you. Jennifer? And then next will be Steve Clark.
Good afternoon. Can I request more like 5 or 6 minutes? I have a presentation to go through. Is that possible?
Go ahead, we'll see.
Okay, we'll see. Oh, thanks. Okay.
Put 5 minutes on the clock, please.
Dr. Longley, this is DPR. I think we want to hear what she has to say.
I understand. It's getting late in the day, and some of us have a long ways to go, so.
All right.
Go ahead.
We'll keep it interesting then. Good afternoon, Chairman Longley and members of the board. Thanks for the opportunity to come and talk a little bit about the Surface Water Protection Program with DPR. I'm mostly going to touch today on some our monitoring and assessment work. As you can see, our little flower here has all of the different components of our program. And one that I want to point out that Tessa already mentioned is that preventative component. We've continued to make efforts to improve the pesticide registration process with the hopes to not have surface water quality problems with newer active ingredients. Here we are with all of the different state agencies and sister agencies. I just want to point out that we operate under different mandates and authority. FIFRA and the Food and Ag Code for DPR and the Clean Water Act and Port of Cologne for state and regional water control boards. We really want to compliment the staff on incorporating us throughout the stakeholder process and through the informational board items. They have consulted us with the language included in the Basin Plan Amendment to ensure that what they're asking of DPR is consistent with both our authority and our existing programs, and we appreciate that. So our surface water monitoring program, we use representative sites to evaluate long-term trends in pesticide concentrations. And what this means is that with our limited resources, we choose to do more intensive sampling at specific sites to gain an understanding of off-site transfer over time. These monitoring efforts evolve over the years, and they are informed by water board staff through our MAA protocol review process.
Is that database, the SURF database, is that a state database or national?
So that is DPR's database,
Okay.
and so that houses all of our data. It's publicly available. And I also want to point out, although we use representative sites for those long-term trends, when we're conducting assessment, we also utilize all available data. So that includes data in the CEDN database collected by state and regional water board programs. So I won't go too much into where our sites are, but just that we have agricultural sampling sites. These are not actually in Region 5, but we go out several times a year and we sample both aqueous sediment and toxicity samples.
Okay.
We can go back.
None of your ag sampling sites are in Region 5?
They are not at this time. We're in the process of expanding to Northern California, and we may include sites in
Yeah,
Region
I
5.
was wondering about that because there's different climatological factors here and
And different crops.
different crops and different cultural habits possibly that can
Right.
infect all of this. And since a large part of the ag is Central Valley, it would seem reasonable that there should be a lot more sampling stations located here then.
So, we have a relatively small staff, so this is where our sampling is, but we pay very close attention to all of the coalition monitoring that
Okay.
happens elsewhere.
Thank you.
Our urban sites, we have some sites in Northern California and some in Southern California, and some of those urban sites are in the Roseville and Folsom area. And again, we go out for both dry water events as well as storm events throughout the year. And again, there seems to be a lag here in this. Oh, there we go. We measure pesticides in aqueous sediment and samples, and then we also do paired toxicity. There have been several mentions already of the 2012 urban pyrethroid regulations, and those are for professional pest control operators. So we're in the process of looking at how effective those regulations are right now. And so that includes both data analysis of the use reporting as well as our surface water monitoring concentrations. And then also to evaluate whether they're effective, we're working with our enforcement branch and the county agricultural commissioner, as well as the city of Roseville. So we're going out, making sure that people are applying pesticides in a manner that's consistent with the regulations to ensure that the regulations are effective, and then also looking at monitoring concentrations to ensure they are effective. And if they aren't, we'll go back to the drawing board and reevaluate. Just a note on our analyses, I have here the reporting limits for the 6 pyrethroids in question for this Basin Plan Amendment and the 5th percentile values. As you can see, our reporting limits, which are done by, our analyses are done by CDFA. They are above these 5th percentile values. However, we report the total concentration, and the proposed Basin Plan Amendment uses this equation to calculate the bioavailable fraction. In the past, we have collected DOC values. Moving forward, we'll collect both particulate organic carbon values and dissolved organic carbon values so that our data can be used in the assessment moving into the first phase of implementation. We also conduct paired toxicity samples with a subset of our monitoring samples. And then finally, we are conducting some work in wastewater. There's not a lot of information on pesticide concentrations, and the information that is available is mostly limited to influent and effluent, and that doesn't allow for analysis of what are the major sources and how you would go about any sort of mitigation. And so we are quantifying those relative contributions so that we can come up with mitigation strategies where necessary. So finally, to come back to our circle here, I just want to mention that when it comes to best management practices, we conduct a lot of in-house research as well as some contract work with academics to identify treatment processes, and we publish all of that on our website. And then when it comes to regulations, I wanted to mention that we are actively engaged with federal EPA in their pyrethroid environmental risk assessment right now.
Keep going, please.
Well, that's all.
Well, that's all. My
Yep.
gosh, very good. Interesting presentation. You're a strong partner, obviously, in our programs. Are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, I've got one. Are things getting worse?
I don't think that they're getting worse. We are in the process, as I mentioned, of evaluating those regulations. We have a statistician on staff, and so we'll be publishing those results within the year. And if it's all right, could I mention the 4% non-commercial application? So Tessa, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is based on mass. You've corrected that sales data to mass. So we've gone out and conducted surveys to try and get after that homeowner component. And from what we can tell, it's minimal, but at the same time, we don't really have a mechanism for, you can't go and regulate one person at a time and make sure they're applying pesticides properly.
And I was just going to say, thank you for your partnership. I mean, it's something like this, you need both agencies to make it work. So, thank you.
Any further comments or, yes?
I was gonna say that I regulate my husband. You know, he used to be that sprayer, and I'm like, don't do that. You know, so we can regulate one person at a time. It's just maybe not on a large scale.
All right, we'll rely on you for that then.
Any further comments? Thank you very much.
I should say, though, for self-regulation, the stormwater program, for the longest time since it started, it was on public outreach and education, and they do have, many of them have over-the-counter type education outreach, and a lot of that's around the use of pesticides, so I imagine there's something
Well,
along there.
one of the problems is a lot of folks, urban folks that do it themselves, oftentimes don't even use the right pesticide. And it's ants, and they hopefully, with not using pyrethroids on ants, the thing's still squirming, so pour some more on, drown it. Go ahead, Steve.
Board member Ramirez, as a husband myself, I feel well regulated way beyond pesticide applications in my house. In fact, I've already had some messages, when's the meeting going to be over and when you're going to be home?
I've got the same messages coming in, so.
So I'll try to keep my comments.
Mutual regulation.
I'll try to keep my
and
comments
I got this
to,
image of Carmen kind of doing a Mr. Tide stern look about don't overuse or something on the cover on the packaging.
a logo on, a little sign on the fridge, right? My name is Stephen Clark. I am the Vice President of Pacific EcoRisk, and I did take the oath. Today I'm going to focus my comments on some work that we do as it relates to compliance monitoring for different regulatory programs and how that would translate over to some of the monitoring provisions that are in the draft TMDL framework. Critical to the success of monitoring programs is that the tools being applied are well vetted. And specifically for this program, I'd like to express that it's going to be very important that the analytical chemistry and any toxicity testing protocols are well vetted, and I did testify to the board some time ago on this subject matter. I want to bring to your attention some work that I'm directly involved in with the Environmental Laboratory Technical Advisory Committee, which is a group that provides resource information to the State Water Board's Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. And we drafted and unanimously accepted a document called the Framework for State Agency Requests to ELAP on New Analytical Methods and Lowered Reporting Limits late last year. And what that was intended to do was to give state agency partners that were considering new regulatory frameworks a process to follow with ELAP to assure that there were well-vetted protocols out there to support the regulations. So specifically as it relates to this program, staff did a very good job in their report on identifying for the pyrethroid pesticide analyses that very low reporting limits were going to be needed, and somewhere around 2 pages or so of an explanation of kind of where the science was right now. And they're acknowledging that very few laboratories are capable currently of being able to achieve those reporting limits, and some allowances on what would be done until that came to be. And I think the important thing to note is that as laboratories try to push for lower reporting limits, they're going to do a couple of things, use different instrumentation and different protocols within the lab. And I'd like to make sure, I think it's important for me as a party that will be implementing the monitoring phase, I'm sure for some clients, that the protocols are comparable. And an example of that, not analytical chemistry, but toxicology is what I presented to the board last time around, in that even a toxicity testing protocol that didn't have a well-vetted promulgated method number showed considerable variability until the SQUIRP, Southern California Coastal Water Research Program, did an interlaboratory comparison study, refined it, and established a method that labs can follow and produce reproducible findings of the presence and absence of toxicity. We'd also like to see reproducible findings in the presence or absence of pyrethroids at the reporting limits of concern. So I support, in conclusion, the inclusion of narrative in the draft that the executive officer has responsibility to approve protocols, methods that will be applied, and I'd like to encourage executive staff to reach out to Christine Sotelo at the State Water Resources Control Board on that program. And one last thing, I've seen a lot of presentations on Hyalella over the last handful of months here and in the staff report. And as I noted with the SQUIRP study, there was considerable variability in Hyalella survival. Kill them and count them, dead or alive. It should be pretty clear cut in terms of conclusions there because the methods were so different among the labs. Harmonized now, the SQUIRP protocol I think is a good step in the right direction, barring a new method by EPA. A lot of the presentation and data you've seen on Hyalella in terms of the plots in the 5th percentile include endpoints that are not kill them and count them, something like immobilization, so a semi-quantitative measure of is the organism moving or not. And I would definitely believe that had that protocol gone under interlaboratory comparisons, that there would be a lot of discussion about how reproducible that is among laboratories. I know that the board staff are recommending the 5th percentile, so in light of that, I think that's a good decision. So thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd definitely be willing to entertain.
Any questions or comments? Might point out that Steve was a valuable member of a science committee we had in the early days of the Irrigated Lands program. And thank you for your contributions to this board, Steve.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Debbie.
Thank you, Chair Longley, and I'm going to go fast because I asked for 5, so we'll see how I do. But I want to start by appreciating staff's effort with reaching out to the stakeholders and having the stakeholder effort, but also in recognizing the potential impacts on POTWs and the constraints that we have through the NPDES permitting system that can result very quickly in unintended consequences. So I really want to appreciate that, and also generally support the use of numeric triggers and the language as triggers, that they're not intended to be used as water quality-based effluence limits or in reasonable potential, because those are 2 areas where NPDES just has us go down a certain path. I also want to add kind of my support in that in that using the 5th percentile is the way to go, considering just the conservative nature and the uncertainties that were just expressed to you. So we are going to be submitting some comments. We've had a chance to go over this. We've been part of this process, so there's more that we're going to be looking at, but I want to highlight some of the areas where we see some concerns. Starting with the conditional prohibition, I think that there's an expectation that POTWs can control pesticide use, and we really have no control. We can help with education, but we are legally not able to prohibit it. So that needs to be recognized, and we still have a little bit of concern with the language there. We'd like to see some additional flexibility for the POTWs to work jointly, especially with other agencies that hold other regulatory systems. So, for example, if a city has a stormwater program and they have to do a management plan, that they can submit one single management plan. Their monitoring can be singular to lead together, that they can compliance reports can be submitted together, those type of things. So we'd like to see those provisions, type of efforts being added there, and certainly where things can be partnered, we'd love to be able to see that too. Another point that kind of was made a little bit earlier is that whether it's on whether or not it's whether you have to do a management plan or the completion of management plan, especially where there is dilution, and we do have quite a few agencies that do have dilution, that would be considered. And so looking that the ability to look at the receiving waters would be added to that rather than just an end of pipe approach. We also have some, well, we'll talk about that, the demonstrate, we're a little concerned about the demonstration that the triggers are not exceeded, and we'll be hopefully presenting some alternative language towards that. But I do want to also touch on the monitoring and surveillance program. Monitoring is very expensive. It's estimated to be $25,000 over a 5-year permit term, and we have some very, very small facilities in our region that would have to undergo this, that their total budget per year, power, everything, is in the $200,000 to $300,000. So $25,000, even though it's supposed to be spread out, is tremendous, and that's a tremendous cost. And so we really want to make sure that the monitoring requirements are reasonable. And then with those monitoring requirements, that they are reliable and that there's commercially available, reliable methods. And so there's some language in there. Yet for us, that means that you can get it at multiple laboratories, and that if you sent it to one laboratory and sent it to another, that there really wouldn't be any significant difference, that they would be virtually the same result. And we're not seeing, we don't necessarily see that. And wastewater matrices are a little bit different. So they usually have to have their own method. And so those are some concerns that we have with that. Certainly, Stephen just discussed about the Hylela and some of the improvements that have been doing there. There's still some questions that we have there. We are, I think one of the monitoring areas that we're most concerned about is there's a requirement, it's specifically particularly requirement number 4 under the monitoring that requires you to design a monitoring program to prove the effectiveness of something. And it's very difficult to do that when you have no control over the substance to begin with. So as I said, we can't control pyrethroids, so we can do outreach, we can do a lot of different things, but we can't control that. And then the other part of that requirement basically says, hey, and if there's surrogates, you POTWs and stormwater go out and figure out the new methods for that. And we really feel like that's inappropriate. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I appreciate your time.
Are there questions or comments?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I've gone through all the cards. Is there anybody else in the audience wishing to comment on this issue? Seeing none then, any discussion among members of the board? This is coming back to us soon. In fact, since we have no further discussion today, going to close the hearing for today, and we'll continue it until the April board meeting. We'll reopen it then.
June.
It says April here.
Well, it's
June.
You've got staff really going crazy right now, but
Staff
June.
wrote this.
June.
June, please.
It's June then, if that's what you say.
So,
Carl only didn't make that up.
So the comments are due a couple weeks, and then you guys will react and put out when's the final staff report come out for public review? Before June?
Yeah, it'd be 30 days prior, so it'd be in May.
Great, thank you.
Okay, that leaves 2 items, and one of them is 18.
I just
Thank
want to
you very
thank
much.
staff for
Thank you.
all their work, and also all the presenters for the information.
Right.
It helps me a lot. It's a complex subject.
Oh,
and
it-
being
this-
exposed to it over and over, it really helps. Thanks.
This is a complex issue, and I particularly, the written comments are very important too. It's something that I spend some time on. We have the update on the compressed ACL process, and I was hoping today that we could have a discussion as part of that on when they get into irrigated lands, the kind of guidance that we'd like to give. I don't think we have enough time today. We don't have the people in the room that I particularly want to be here. Maybe we can do that in June, because I would certainly like to have office and enforcement around when we're talking.
About just in the philosophy and board direction.
Exactly.
In policy setting of how to do enforcement?
That's right.
Okay. But today we can do the compressed.
Let's do the compress, and I won't expound further on that. And Andrew, you've gotten an awful lot of philosophy the last couple of days, so I'm sure you work with your friends and comrades over in Office of Enforcement.
Our next meeting is in April, and that's in Fresno. So we could ask someone from the office to travel to Fresno.
If they could be there, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Chair Longley. And I just, first of all, wanted to mention that Wendy Wiles wasn't able to be here today, so I'm giving the presentation for her. So, Chairman Longley and members of the board, my name is Andrew Altsvokes, and I'm an Assistant Executive Officer in the Rancho Cordova office. The item today is to have a discussion with the board about a new process that we've been starting to implement in this office for compressed ACLs. And this is something that Ms. Wiles began working with David Boyers in the Office of Enforcement on several months ago as a new way to issue ACL complaints for discretionary actions. And so currently we're essentially piloting this in this office, and I'll explain, we've started with our stormwater program, but we'd like to talk to the board about if they think it's appropriate, then expanding it to other programs and of course to the other offices. And so you'll have before you a copy of the slides as well as a copy of one of the completed compressed ACL that we have done. So this is just a summary of the presentation, why we would like to do this, the process and the timeline for the compressed ACL versus the traditional, the example of the completed one, which was for a Dollar General construction site, the types of violations and programs that this might work for, and when we might use a compressed ACL, and the potential benefits of using it. So the idea for these, as I mentioned, began with our stormwater program, and within the construction stormwater program, the general permit that they're under requires that developers are supposed to install an effective combination of erosion control and sediment control best management practices, or BMPs, in order to contain the contaminants that go along with stormwater. And so the photos on this slide show typical BMPs. So on the left-hand side, those are yellow fiber rolls and straw mulch, and then a green bonded fiber matrix on the right-hand side picture. And the issue with the construction stormwater is that we find the most serious violations, of course, in the rainy season, in the fall and the winter, and right before, right after, during rain events, and so this past fall of 2016, we found a number of dischargers that hadn't installed BMPs, that had sediment-filled muddy water flowing off their sites, and we wanted to issue ACLs for those sites, or taken some sort of enforcement. So there are a couple things to consider. Traditionally, we've had some obstacles to issuing ACLs for stormwater. The first being that staff during the winter need to be in the field. So in terms of working on an ACL, generally they're out doing inspections, writing their inspection reports, and they're fairly occupied with that. And so part of what that means is that historically we've only been able to do one or two of these at most for a stormwater season, and it can take, it says here, over a year even for a relatively simple one, and I'll kind of explain why that is. And so what we would like to do is to be able to issue the ACLs in the winter during the current rainy season, so they'll have the most impact. And so what Wendy did is she looked and saw that Region 2 had a process that they had done for a particular enforcement that was sort of a quick process. It resulted in a somewhat smaller penalty, but it was quite expeditious. So what she did is she worked with David. She kind of worked with that document from Region 2 and added to it the penalty calculation from our enforcement policy, as well as a small short calculation of economic benefit. And what that ended up with is the template for these compressed ACLs was approximately 10 pages plus the inspection report. So we always have an inspection report when we do an inspection. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking this short template and attaching an inspection report that we already have to it. And that's opposed to a traditional ACL, which once you put the evidence in, you develop the full ACL with all the findings and everything, can be 50-plus pages as well as quite a bit of work for staff. So the first of these compressed ACLs that we did was for a Dollar General site in Pioneer, and this is one where it's gone all the way through the process. The penalty has been paid, so we can talk in detail about it. So this was a 4-acre site on the hillside above Highway 88. The staff first inspected the site in late October during a predicted rain event, and they found a lack of erosion control BMPs, improperly installed sediment control BMPs, and a discharge of turbid stormwater off of the site. And so, and you can observe in the pictures there, on the picture on the left-hand side is what the staff observed in that initial inspection. So what we were able to do is, less than a month after the inspection and finding these problems, we issued one of these compressed ACLs in the amount of $55,000, and we required, as a condition of settling that matter, that the contractor stabilize the site. And what happened is they accepted the settlement and they stabilized the site, and that's what you can see on the right-hand side picture. That's what the site should have looked like to begin with. So let's see. And so I mean, both from getting the penalty paid, getting that done, as well as getting the site in the condition that it needed to be in, we consider this to be a success. So I'll now just talk a little bit about some of the differences between the more traditional ACL approach, and this could be for stormwater or really for any of our programs. So the first thing, and what you'll see, is that it can often take over a year to go through that traditional process for us. So the first thing would be, there would be inspections in the winter in this case. Inspection reports would be written. In the spring then, we would sit down with the staff, we'd look over all of the sites where they had seen violations, and we'd prioritize, decide which ones were the worst, which ones needed further enforcement. And then we'd start gathering the data that we needed. We'd go and look at the rainfall data, make sure we understood the rainfall events, and that sort of thing. We might issue a 13267 order for technical information from the discharger in order to, again, to sort of bolster our case, make sure we understood what was going on. We would also then try to calculate the gallons of discharge if possible, and that can also, of course, take some time. And then once we've got that, then we would start to write the ACL. So and generally what we would do then is we would actually, in the ACL findings, we'd restate what was in the inspection reports. We'd enumerate, in detail all the violations. We'd go through the penalty factors for each violation and the economic benefit. And then our practice is to issue a pre-settlement letter to basically offer to settle, say we're anticipating this ACL. If you'd like to discuss settlement, come in and discuss it with us. And we'd sort of then start that process of talking with the discharger about the ACL. And then again, we'd sort of meet, there'd be negotiations. That generally might take several meetings over the course of a month or two. And depending on the complexity of the case, it could take more than that. If we're talking with them about a supplemental environmental project, then that'll add some additional time generally as well. And then, finally, we would end up with assuming this, and so this is assuming one that doesn't go to the board, that we are able to settle. Then the settlement order would go out for a 30-day comment period, and then would go to the advisory team and the board chair for approval. And so, as I said, oftentimes that could take over a year to go through that whole process from the initial inspection to the finalization and approval of the settlement. So the compressed ACL process, as I mentioned, is so there'd be several inspections. In the cases that we've had so far, we've had 2 inspections. And so basically, the staff have gone out there once, seen problems, talked to the discharger about it, gone back out, there's still problems, and that's, you know, that's the sort of thing we want to then make sure we're addressing. And so then what we do is just write this compressed ACL, attach the inspection reports to it, and what we're trying to do in this case, in order to expedite the process, is to stick with the most obvious violations, the ones where, you know, we're not going to be arguing over calculations of discharge or things like that. It's sort of the ones where, if you recall those pictures of the Dollar General, well, did you have BMPs? No, there weren't any BMPs out there. I mean, that's sort of a, you know, it's a pretty obvious thing, and you know, easy to prove. So you have the pictures, there weren't BMPs. And then we go through, as we always do, the penalty factors, but we, in a traditional ACL, we have, you know, several paragraphs written up oftentimes for each factor. In this case, we have a couple sentences. This is, you know, that just enumerate why we chose the factor, but very, very briefly. And okay, and then what we send them this package. We tell them that they have 30 days to either accept our proposal, to contest it. If they contest it, that would mean that we would then go forward and issue a formal ACL and then go through that longer process, or reject it. And what we've seen is that having one meeting with the discharger is, I mean, it's certainly a good idea. It's useful. It lets them understand where we're coming from. If we have any inaccuracies in anything that we put out there, then we make sure that we hear about those, and if those need to be corrected, that they get corrected. But again, we have one meeting. So far they've all been solved with that one meeting. But if it was going to go beyond that, then we would want to go into the longer ACL process.
So what's the difference between contesting and rejecting?
Well, that's a good question, because I'm just going to see what Wendy wrote.
Okay.
I apologize. So I guess contesting is that would be them providing additional data. You know, so, well, we think you got this wrong. Can you change this? And rejection would be like, you know, forget it. We don't even want to talk to you about this. And or, you know, we think this is completely wrong. And then, you know, so I think contesting is we can discuss it and make sure we're on the same page. Rejecting is they don't, you know.
And a rejection means they want to go through the full ACL process?
Well, that would be what we would do then. In that case, we would go through the full ACL process. I'm not sure whether they would.
Well, okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. Let me ask, if I can ask another question while we're on this page.
Absolutely.
Who decides whether the compressed ACL is the way to go?
So
and
that's
when is that decision made?
So that decision is made. I mean, in these cases, Wendy would work with her staff, come up with suggestions, and then they would talk about it with me. We'd talk about it with the Office of Enforcement, try to understand whether it's appropriate. And again, really what we're looking for is something that, and I'll kind of touch on that a little later, but something that can be, that the matter can be solved quickly.
So you answered my question, I think. It's the decision to whether or not a compressed ACL should be initiated is an agency decision.
Yes, absolutely.
It looks to me like it's up there in the first bullet.
Well, but it's not something that a stormwater discharger could say, oh yeah, here's my NOV. Can we just hurry this thing up, and I'll ask for a smaller penalty with a compressed. I mean, that's my question.
No, that certainly hasn't happened. I don't think that would happen in that way. But yeah, so far that certainly hasn't happened, I can say that.
Okay, well, and the only reason I ask, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, we can certainly come back with Wendy and ask her other questions, but if I was someone who knew what was going on and knew that I could wrap this thing up in 3 months with a smaller penalty and just pay for my obvious violations, you know, I may try and opt that way. Not that it's a bad thing. I mean, I certainly don't like a year and a half to get to the point where something may happen. But I'm just asking sort of what the thought process is there.
Yeah, and so, I mean, when we do have discharges, of course, come to us, say, we know we have a violation, we know we're going to get a penalty, and then we would decide, well, do we want to go through a full ACL depending on how complicated the situation is, or is it just, yeah, well, it's a pretty obvious violation, let's just try to get this hammered out quickly.
Well, it appears to me that with the savings in staff time, assuming, you know, we'll go back and we'll revisit this in time to see how it's working, but assuming it works, and I think it will. I've already talked to you, obviously, about a couple of them. That the savings in time and effort will allow us to cover more sites, quickly making more sites come into compliance. And that struck me as the real value of it.
Yeah, and absolutely. And so we've already seen that, even just with the issuance. I mean, we have one fully executed, but even just with the issuance of 4 of them now in construction stormwater, our inspectors are telling us that they're hearing that everybody knows that we're out taking enforcement. And so it's even beyond we haven't done any formal publicizing of it yet. We're just doing our first press release, but the word is out. So
It's amazing how the word gets out.
Indeed.
You know, the other thing that I see as beneficial to doing it this way is that in the longer process, you know, you have sort of an accumulation of, you know, there was 50 violations, you know, during the winter season, which 25 are the worst or which 15 are the worst. Whereas this, if it's compressed, there's certainly a benefit to the state in getting them settled quickly when it comes to staff time, like you said, and being able to, you know, capture sort of the seriousness of the violation if everybody's getting tagged. Whereas if I got a small one, you know, maybe I won't be in the top 25, maybe I'll never see it, you know, as a discharger. So that's first. But second, I think that, you know, it's not uncommon for, you know, negotiations to go on in civil cases. And I think that, you know, I think that one of the discussions will have to be. Did you turn me off?
You're on.
No, mine went off. Somebody turned me off.
You just turned it off then.
It's not working.
It's there. It says Carmen here. I'm not touching it. Oh.
Okay, there you go. Thanks. I see where I rank here. All right. No, so what I was going to say is that, I mean, if we have concerns whether the dollar amounts make sense, then that's one thing. But, you know, these seem kind of good and effective. So.
Yeah, so I mean, we believe they will be, and part of the question for the board is then, you know, what are the situations where the board feels it's more appropriate or not, and I have some sort of examples or, you know, a couple of just questions on that for the board.
Well, and then there's the other thing about this is that they know that, I would hope they know, that if they don't wrap this up pretty quickly, they're going to try to drag it out. Well, you might as well just go to the long process.
Right, and if we do that, then we will certainly look at the full spectrum of violations. We'll look at violations through the date of the issuance of the ACL, and it'll, you know, so absolutely. So that's just, we've already gone through that. So as I mentioned before, so far we've issued 5 of these, and there are 2 more that we're working on. The penalties that we've proposed so far have ranged from $55,000 to $215,000, so not insignificant penalties, I would say. And 4 of them, as I mentioned, were for construction stormwater. And again, the industry's taking notice, and the staff like it because we're able to kind of move through them more quickly as well.
Andrew, what were the other ones?
So that's what we have. The other ones, there's one. Well, one was construction and a 401 certification violation, and in that one we focused on the 401 violations. They were working in a stream bed, and and then the other last one was a sanitary sewer overflow. And then the one, as it says here, the ones in preparation are from wastewater treatment plant and then an industrial stormwater site.
How do you find out about these? Is it public complaint?
Well, so far for the construction ones and for the 401, it's been inspections. The inspectors have been out there, and in general, our inspectors they're pretty good about knowing which sites plan on working through the winter, and of course you can work through the winter. You just have to, you have to be more careful. And so they spend a little more time looking at those sites, driving by, making sure that things are okay. And so that's largely what it is. We do receive complaints. And that can be part of it. For the wastewater treatment one, they reported that to us as they're required to do. So.
And also, isn't it because they've already pulled their permits and the inspectors are going out and checking?
Yeah. Well, so in the for construction stormwater, it's a general permit. They're enrolled in. And again, so then future use. I mean, we're thinking about things where the violations are pretty straightforward. So failure to submit monitoring reports, failure to submit technical reports, where it's one of those things where either you've done it or you haven't, more or less, or incomplete reports, or failure to enroll. And that then gets to some of the things that we've talked about with the irrigated lands program. And that's something where we may not have a lot of time to talk about it today, but I did want to query the board about that. The next program that I'd really like to make a push for using this technique is in the irrigated lands program, both because of the number of dischargers that we have and potential violations, as well as the violations that we've been talking about thus far in irrigated lands have been these lack of enrollment or lack of reports, where it's fairly straightforward in terms of the violation.
And I won't expand on that. You heard us yesterday.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, and I think we do have some good direction from the board now in terms of what some of the expectations are. And so again, this is what we've already talked about. So the violations are pretty straightforward, and when we think the discharger will accept the offer. So again, we've gone through some of the benefits. There's, in a traditional ACL, you're basically getting ready for litigation, and there's a lot of preparation for that. We want to make sure everything's as tight as can be, and it takes a lot of staff time. With the compressed ACL, again, the discharger knows they violated. They're pretty much in agreement that they violated, and we try to then narrow it down to what are the most obvious violations. And so, as we talked about, we can then issue more ACLs and get better compliance. I mean, and of course, the compliance, and you saw in the Dollar General, I mean, they paid the penalty, but they also got their site in good shape. And for that company in particular, they have a number of other sites that they're constructing right now as well. And so it sort of it magnifies itself in terms of the benefit to the environment. So again, the goal our overall goal is always getting compliance, and then we want to be able to try to expand this to other programs, and also, of course, to the other two offices for these types of violations, and in specific to try to start using it for irrigated lands. And I guess what I would propose is, based on the input that we got from the board yesterday on all those cases, is to use those as sort of our guidance in terms of what the board thinks about the size of the operation, the culpability, and so I think we have some idea of what the board would like in those cases, I believe.
Yeah, right, and I think we need better data when we get into reports and what it costs them to prepare reports. It's the reports that we were talking about, the farm evaluations, apparently pretty cheap on a per acre basis, and I think we need to work together on what might be more appropriate for that. Certainly you heard about stacking, but
yeah,
we'll go through that in more detail later.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Andrew, one of the, over time, I mean, the review process for which ones to do, basically the staff and the group makes their decisions. You or another assistant executive officer review them, but I'm wondering if there shouldn't be like a little bit broader group in the review, because, you know, it's easy to just start slipping down, let's just pump these out and get these done. And
yeah, and I think, I mean, so I think if we, well, I have, of course, already talked with Clint Snyder and Clay Rogers about this, the AEOs and the other two offices, and so, and we will, I think that's essentially, in terms of broadening our look at them, as the three of us working together to make sure that we are, that we are using them appropriately.
A question I have is, so the violators, they do know they have the option, again, not to accept the compressed ACL and go through the whole process.
Absolutely, and that's laid out in the letter that they received, sort of, 4 different options that they have.
And I would emphasize that very often it may wind up the situation where the compressed ACL is a lower value. It may wind up being the situation where the compressed ACL is right about in the ballpark of where the final ACL would be, or where the ACL complaint would charge something to be. It's just that there's a little less attention paid to, really, really having an airtight case at the time that the prosecution team brings it to the discharger under the compressed process, as opposed to bringing it before the board, where it really does have to be locked down on every I dotted, every T crossed, every scientific finding ground down to the finest detail. Really, what we're, we don't want to penalize dischargers for exercising their due process right to a hearing by always having higher ACL. It's really just more in terms of the time investment that the investigatory staff will have before the issuance of the ACL, and it's totally defensible in that light.
It also decreases their investment in consultants and attorneys and so forth.
Yeah, and that's why I was just going to say there's another sister agency that settles a lot of these things, and many of them are without lawyers. You have a small mom and pop trucking organization or something in A or B. Oh, there you go. Would say, here's what we want to settle for. Mm-hmm. And if you bring in a consultant, you bring in an attorney, they bring in an attorney. And it does raise the stakes. So if it's a black and white violation, I'm supportive of this. I think it, having to sort of, as you put it, gear up for litigation on every single thing is a big burden. Mm-hmm. That being said, the worry that I would have is, we'll settle for this, and if you don't settle for this, we're going to throw the book at you, and we're going to do per gallon, or we're going to do everything, and it has a sense of, take it or we're going to do a lot worse, right? Rather than, obviously you were in violation, and here's sort of a routine standard penalty that goes along with that, and so I just want to make sure we're careful, and to follow up on Bob's note, I don't know if it's some sort of review or check, maybe after the fact, some sort of regular, this is what we did, or maybe it's, I don't know, but just the idea that it just goes through one or two staff people to, and I know it wouldn't, but that'd be my concern.
To be careful with how it's used and when it's used.
Right, like this Dollar General example, the contractor obviously messed up. The cost of compliance was X. He did it, he complied, he's not gonna do it again. It sounds like a very, very reasonable response.
Right.
Now, I think back to Rockland Crossing, where, I think we settled it for $600,000 or something. It was a much bigger violation, and we went through the water issues, and that ended up getting sent to the state board, and it just adds to the complexity, and if we're reasonable and we can get this done, I'm very, very supportive. I just worry that it doesn't come across as, here's X, if you don't like X, here's a potential of 5X. Right, which at point they have to call the lawyer and they have to call everybody else, and I just don't want to get into that cycle either.
I think that maybe within Bob, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add, because I like your summary points and the goals, the compliance, and maybe there should be just a one-page sheet on when these are going to be used and how you use sort of guidelines or something.
Yeah, my concern, because it sounds like we're trying to bystep our traditional approach to
enforcement.
Progressive, thank you very much, progressive enforcement. Yeah. And when the stormwater first started in the program, we were out doing this because the contractors in the construction program, I remember this years ago because I was staff at the time doing this, they knew that the program meant something in the Bay Area, but they didn't think they had to do it in the Central Valley. So one way to get the attention of the building industry was to start having formal enforcement. And it got the attention to where we were kind of only doing it to certain really large facilities. So we've gone through a recession, and the home building industry kind of died for a little bit, and now it's coming up, and we're finding that there are a whole brand new group of people out there trying to implement this, and we're seeing some real compliance issues. That's what you'll hear from Wendy's staff who do most of the inspections. And I think this is a very good tool to get compliance early on and by a larger group of people. But I really, my only caution, I think this is a great tool, but to expand it to where now people are thinking every little violation is going to be equivalent to a ticket, that's not the way the board's operated. And I need to make sure that there, for the board and for the dischargers, that there be some parameters around here to ensure that that we're not just overstepping that progressive enforcement approach.
I appreciate that, because I think progressive enforcement, where if they get a call, you go see them, maybe there's all that should still be there. I don't want to trip right to if you have anything wrong, it's a ticket. But if you get to the point through progressive enforcement and there's a violation, from that point forward, there's a potential.
We have a lot of violations. So not every violation is met with an ACL. If you remember from our presentations on the enforcement of the which the new board members haven't seen yet, you will in a couple months, next couple of board meetings, the pyramid, the ACL is at the very top. That is the most, for those sites that are pretty egregious, the most recalcitrant. So the staff is kind of, by doing this, is maybe we're not looking at the worst of the worst and saving them for the worst. We're trying to go at some of the lower levels to move up to informal, because they truly do violate the permit, so an ACL is an option. But the dollar one was an example. That would have been a great case, but we wouldn't have seen it for a couple of years. So with the compressed, we were able to see it earlier. So that was a good example of that. But some of these others, I don't know if the staff should pursue.
So as you get more experience on this, I'm wondering if it would be a good idea to, when you got more cases under your belt, to come back and we have a discussion at that point in time. We'll have more case studies to look at, and I'm not sure that once this gets rolling, assuming it will, that we need to do that every year. But it might be at least one more time around, and we'll see at that point.
If I could make a comment, especially for the new board members, as to how some of this process will work. It isn't the case that these ACLs, when they are settled, are settled exclusively by the prosecution team. So what happens and what's been happening right now is Andrew's unit is entrusted with a lot of discretion to take enforcement as he feels appropriate. Some of those have been queued up for the compressed ACLs. When those do settle, some of those are actually out for settlement right now. One has finalized and has been settled, but the final signature is the advisory team. And you collectively as a board have empowered Pamela to sign those settlement agreements. And so she will still be exercising her discretion when she sees the final settlement package. I work with her, Stephanie, Andrew also worked with her, Adam works with her to really evaluate all the arguments that the discharger made, see how the final dollar amount fits with the board's priorities that have been articulated through other policies and other enforcement actions. So there are really two huge levels of discretion where Andrew's applying it. Andrew Altavote is applying it when he issues the ACL and decides that it fits the mold for something that fits with the compressed ACL. And then for Pamela when she signs a settlement order, really feeling that the board would support this type of action.
Well, I also consult with Dr. Longley.
Yeah,
I do not do it on my own.
Whoever the chair is, and that's one of the things we want to continue, is obviously that we have the kind of consultation that Pamela insists on for everything. I do have, unless somebody has more questions, I do have a card here.
I have a.
Could I actually address just two things? The first is in terms of tracking it. We've already talked with the Office of Enforcement about collecting data on the actual compliance and making sure that it is resulting in compliance
Better
generally.
Compliance, yeah.
And then the other one, as it relates to these, or at least to the Dollar General in specific, the stormwater. I mean, our general practice has been that, you know, if we go out on a site and the BMPs aren't there, aren't working, we talk to them, they put the BMPs in place, and then the next time we're out, they're working. The chances of getting an ACL, I would say, in that case are slim. It's more the cases where we go out there, we talk with them, we say, you know, you don't have anything here. We go back and there's still nothing there. That's more the case where it's, you know, so it's progressive enforcement, I guess, in that way. Yeah.
Any further comments, questions?
Yeah, and acknowledging that I missed part of the conversation, but one of the things that I would like to see is to make sure, and I appreciate the autonomy and the trust they have in you, and I feel that way also. But as these first few are going out, I would appreciate it if, you know, Pamela and maybe other people of the prosecution team, or whoever it is, help shape the dollar amount that these are being sent out as, for two reasons. Did we talk about this while I was gone? Okay. The reason is, the first one is certainly the benefit of the discharger, right? If they're weighing this consideration as a business, like, okay, should we settle, should we not settle? I think that getting an offer sort of means something. And if it's your name on it and they think, okay, we're going to settle and that's your number, and it goes to someone and they're like, no way, this number's not off. Not only does it undermine the credibility of the person who sent the offer, it also, makes this maybe run less efficiently. So I think that in the beginning, certainly as these are getting formulated, if there was, maybe input as to, okay, what's the board been doing, or what's the dollar amount, or what's the temperature of the board? This is a young program. Maybe they've been more lenient now, but now it's 6 months older. They're certainly not going to be as lenient anymore. And so some kind of temperature like that, because I would like to avoid things coming back and making it look like, these are preliminary. I understand that they are, but to not undermine the credibility of the person that signs them.
The prosecution team makes that decision, and then it comes to the advisory team, and I know on other ACLs there have been questions, and there has been some back and forth on the amount being asked. I feel confident that is.
Yeah,
going to be
we
something.
will not, I cannot weigh in on what I only receive a copy once it's gone to the discharger, unfortunately, and so it's always after the fact.
But she can say no.
I know, but if she says no, then
It's happened.
I understand, but, you know, she says no on behalf of the board, then what does that mean?
Well,
What would someone in, you know, Andrew's position look
Andrew's
like
in
going out to the
Andrew's
public?
in a very difficult job, and part of it's
Right.
because of this ex parte thing. And because of that, he has a crystal ball. We bought him a crystal ball, I think. It was an expensive one.
I think I cracked it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I bet it's cracked.
It really takes some judgment on his part.
Right, and that's, just want to, you know, make sure that,
Right, understand.
And we do try to be pretty clear when we meet with the dischargers and let them know that this is the process, and that, you know, we can agree to something. That doesn't mean that the advisory team is going to approve it. And what we tell them is, I mean, I, Clay, Clint, we try to take our best guess of what we think is appropriate and what we think the board would find appropriate. And often we're right, and sometimes
Well,
we're not.
I
think-
guess I'm a little bit concerned, though, because I caught him out back with darts one day.
No, but I would suggest, and I think we can do this, if Patrick says no, then I guess not, but we could have a discussion, Patrick and I and Adam could have a discussion with Andrew on what kinds of information, minimum information that should be presented in each one of these for the advisory team to help us make sure that some of these checks and measures are in place for the board.
I do have a card.
Can I make a comment on this too?
Certainly.
I'm satisfied at the end of the process that Pamela talks to board chair, so I think we've got a good process, and we discuss how to do
And-
things at the board meetings well enough.
And at least one time, and probably more, it's come to the board.
Yeah, frankly, some of the irrigated lands ACLs that you saw were a result of, there actually was a settlement hammered out between the prosecution team and the discharger. It went to Pamela and the advisory team. Pamela checked in with Dr. Longley. Dr. Longley didn't decide on behalf of the board. Rather, his comment was, this amount actually represents a pretty significant policy determination. We think that policy determination should be made by the board as a whole, and that's why of the few of the irrigated lands ACLs that you've heard over the past year, there were a few of those that were significant enough that the whole board weighed in on them, and that's how the process unfolds.
So what I take out of that is that in the end effect, if an amount is decided on, there is considerable thought, is this something that the board would approve? And that's in the thought process.
Yeah.
And if that is, we don't know, it comes to the board. So, good, thank you. And we'll hopefully be able to get a briefing later when you got more of these. David? And Tess, are you still charged with talking? Okay, and I don't have a card, but you told me, so that's good enough.
Chair Longley, members of the board, David Corey, representing the San Joaquin Valley Drainage Authority. I'm not sure if this is going to be taken up in another agenda item at another meeting in terms of how the enforcement aspects to the ILRP and how the compression fits into that, or if this is the time to talk about that, or what you guys are thinking about.
I would suggest, if you have a perspective, let the board know the perspective now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I see some benefits to the compressed process. I think it could have a role in the ILRP enforcement actions. I think we should have, or it would be useful, at least from my perspective, to have a more complete discussion of how those enforcement actions take place and how we can improve those. When I look at the goals of enforcement, and I watched you guys wrestle with those enforcement actions yesterday, it seems like you were looking at ensuring compliance with the order, and not only for the grower who was in front of you, but for all the growers, to make sure that they realize that people have to turn in their reports, they need to sign up, and those sorts of things. And on the reporting aspect of this, the magnitudes of the fines are quite large from most growers' perspectives on some of these reports. And you looked at some of these, were 3 years old. It took 3 years for these to come to the board. It seems like if we came up with a process that was slightly more efficient in getting these to the boards more quickly, and rather than having really large fines, if there was more certainty that if you didn't turn in a report, you were going to get a fine and it was going to come quickly. That would maybe send a better signal, and a signal that would play better to the grower than the large fines to just a few individuals. I mean, we certainly do report to our constituents and those, what the magnitude of the fines are. But, the folks who want to comply, it doesn't matter that much. They're doing the best they can. They're trying to comply. Those who are potentially gaming the system or just lazy, they're likely to say, there've been 4 of these. What are the likelihoods they're going to get to me? Yeah, it's a whole large number, and they're going to roll the dice. I think they're wrong in that analysis. I think you guys are slow, but eventually you're going to get everybody, and they're going to. But they don't see that. They don't. When they see these long, drawn-out processes, there's not the immediate enforcement, and I think speeding those up with significantly lower fines, where if you miss your report, and maybe there's some grace period, but if you miss your report by 6 months, by the time we have to turn it into the regional board, there is certain enforcement. Everybody gets one, and then everybody in the coffee shop has an enforcement where they're paying a couple $1,000s, and they're saying, "Whoa, these guys are for real," and it spreads that word better than 4 people getting $30,000 fines. And I really think looking at that enforcement, I don't know what the magnitude of those fines should be, whether you need to have it, a first offense is one thing, a second offense is different. But discussing how we best encourage or induce the growers to comply and get that word out is useful. And unfortunately, it's just Tess and I here today. I know Perry had interest in this. He wanted to point out.
Well, Tess is speaking for Perry.
Right. Well,
we'll imagine Perry.
I'm going to speak for Perry a little bit too. He did point out that they have 500 growers that miss some sort of their reporting requirements. I mean, that's a huge workload for you, and that's just one coalition. I think a lot of those really aren't people who are trying to escape it. They're just whatever the reason is. They're not recalcitrants.
Well, I was going to try to avoid it, but. One of the things is, and I think it was shown today during the executive officer's report on the video on Perry, if people are not in the coalition, they can't get the training. We can't determine what impact they're having on water quality. I, as one board member, think that fine should be quite large if you haven't enrolled. We know there's mitigating circumstances. People die,
Right.
All kinds of tragedy happens in human life, and I think we have to have a heart too. The reports, I'm not sure that we have a good handle on what it costs to prepare a report, and there's different kinds of reports that have to be prepared down the line. Nutrient management is different than a farm evaluation. And I think we need a better handle. We need help from you folks on getting that data.
Yeah, and that's why I think a more complete discussion with more coalition representatives to sort of, and probably some work with staff ahead of time to talk about what is, and I don't know how this fits into the enforcement policy. I'm sure Tess will go into that in terms of what flexibility you have, but I think we can do better. And when you look at some of the folks that some of the $26,000, $34,000 fines on folks, that's a pretty hefty fine. But we do need to make sure that people realize this program's for real. You need to turn in your reports. And again, I think moving towards certainty of enforcement might be a better way to go than just ratcheting up the fines to those large numbers.
Yeah.
So
Denise?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you, David. I mean, I'm just thinking about the cost, people not enrolling.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't know legally how that could be done, but if there was a fee with that, if there was a fee for people not turning in their evaluation forms, and that to me could be a part of the compressing process, the ACL compression process, versus, like you say, letting it be a long drawn out thing, and it would help your coalition do its job because it's not continuing to go on. So I think you're on to something there, and I don't know about staff and how you see, but it's worth us taking a look at.
I think it would fit, and in fact, since we weren't going to have that discussion, but if we are, I was going to suggest that to Andrew to get more quick response, so it's out to, we get the list who doesn't submit, so we know who they are. Doing a broad swath of those all at one time can certainly set a fire through a bunch of the members of the coalition and get their attention quickly. And it doesn't have to be a huge fine. And that way, we're not waiting for 3 years' worth of non-submittals.
So after we have some experience and have a conversation here about it, I think we can look at other methods that may, that you are talking about that might better serve the programs and serve the farmers too.
And one of the things in terms of avoidance of compliance costs that it may not be useful for every one of the reports, but I have to think through this a little bit. But on some of them, some of that is data gathering. And it's important to have that data over multiple years. So if they miss the report, I mean, part of the enforcement could be, you got to turn it in even though you missed it. I mean, you can go back. I mean, you could have gone back with those folks who didn't enroll and say, hey, not only do you have to enroll, but you got to do a nitrogen management summary report if you're in a high vulnerability area. So we have that data.
Interesting thought.
And that avoids this idea that you get out of doing 3 years of reports. Now, I don't know if that's legal. I don't worry about that. I just went to law school. But policy-wise, it makes sense, and it does avoid that free rider problem of saying, well, if I can just skate through a couple years, I can avoid filling out some forms.
Saves
If
a
you
lot of
know,
staff time as well.
if you know you're going to have to do it anyway, might as well do it now. So those are, I think it'd be useful to have some of those discussions, whether it's with staff or in front of the board. I think we can have a more productive and more efficient way to induce the growers to actually comply and give us the data we need to effectively implement this program.
I would also suggest, and you're probably well aware of it, but since the state board is in the process of revising its enforcement policy, some of these issues, particularly as they pertain to agricultural acres, enrolled and not enrolled, frankly, the enforcement policy wasn't really designed with those type of growers and those type of concerns in mind. I don't know if they'll fall on deaf ears or not, but it's worthwhile asking the state board to incorporate some of those concepts into its enforcement policy.
And I was talking with Tess. I'm going to defer to Tess and bring her up here and let her answer that question because she's more familiar with that. But so why don't we just, if it's okay with you, if there's no other questions.
Very definitely. Tess, come
defer.
ahead. The problem is you get these attorneys talking and trying to move on.
It's because we charge by the word.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tess Denham, Somac Simmons and Dunn. I'm here today for the East San Joaquin Water Quality Coalition. And Patrick, we have raised those concerns at the state board level with respect to the water quality enforcement policy. I'll talk to you offline about the conversation I had in response. But anyway.
It might be similar to the one I had
Yeah,
as well.
probably. But yes, we actually have had some meetings as well and are working also with Board Member Diadamo to try to get some recognition within the enforcement policy that its application in the agricultural sense doesn't work as well as they think it does with respect to the other types of programs and violations. And I think, for what we're looking at as far as, some type of graduated automatic amount for, late reports, the question will be, is that something that needs to be done in a big P policy, versus just on a discretionary basis? And I think it probably would need to be, at least to be defensible for all of you. And so I think that is something, we in the ag community have talked about recently that we'd really like to explore because, one, I do think and agree that doing a lot of fines on a smaller amount to more people will be far more effective than, the process that we currently have. And so the East San Joaquin would be very supportive of that approach. And, and especially for late reports versus those that have failed to enroll. We do see a difference between that. So we would be supportive and would like to participate in any discussions on how we might try to create that process and that policy. And we will continue at the state board level and pushing that forward as well as we're having those conversations about the current policy. I also would just note, putting on my NPDS hat for a moment for representing a lot of NPDS folks, I see this compressed process also having a benefit. How many times have you all got phone calls from NPDS dischargers saying, would you find me so the citizen suit notice of intent letter that I just received that they've trolled off of the CWIX site would go away, right? I mean, we get a lot of industrial and construction stormwater people that, go out, you get these environmental organizations. Some are more credible than others, but throw out, 50 notices of intent to 50 different dischargers at one point in time. And had there been a compressed ACL already done, then that discharger has a much larger defense to be able to state the regional board has conducted diligent prosecution and can defend themselves against citizen suits as well. So there's another advantage by getting in, doing it quickly, and so I see a huge advantage in that for NPDES dischargers.
And the question was asked earlier, has anybody ever asked us, that's one situation where we actually have been proposition. Can you fine us? Because frankly, the board, in many cases, I won't say in all, but in many cases, the board's process is more reasonable than some court processes can be when you have an environmental litigant on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. I see, and as part of the reporting, I see it not as a mandatory minimum penalty, that's in statute, but something similar that we know the consistency, it's graduated, and you have more certainty.
Any questions?
Can I add one thing, Dr. Longley, which is in terms of people kind of, I don't know, ignoring the program or rolling the dice. I mean, that was actually part of the impetus for the stormwaters. Our inspections were hearing anecdotally from the dischargers that, well, we're just going to see what happens and, see if we get caught. And it was starting to be, sort of a cost of doing business and taking that chance. And so this was part of the impetus was to address that. And I think doing something similar for the irrigated lands program, we should figure out how to best do that.
Right. Good point, Colonel. Any further comments? Very good. We'll move to the last agenda item. Agenda item 29. Election of the chair and vice chair. At this time, we move to the election of the chair and vice chair for the Regional 5 Water Board for the next year, or this year until the first board meeting next year. Any discussion or nominations?
Unless I hear otherwise, I would nominate Carl to keep his role as chairman.
I would second that.
Any discussion?
I like Carl also as the chair, but I'd like
don't
to
know.
No, I'd just like to know if anybody else is interested. I mean,
Thank you. Well, with that, I'll call for the vote. I can't even talk. It's getting late. And after yesterday, I started at about 80% speed this morning. Roll call vote, please.
Okay, Mr. Costantino?
Aye.
Ms. Brar?
Yes.
Ms. Ramirez?
yes.
Mr. Schneider? Dr. Markham?
Aye.
Ms. Kadara? Dr. Longley? Oh, no. Yeah, Dr. Longley?
I'll vote yes.
Okay. Motion carries.
Very good. We'll go now to the election of the vice chair.
I guess I would ask the same question. I'd like to know who's interested. My intent would be, I appreciate the work that Denise has done. I don't know if John's interested this year. He's been interested in the past. I don't know, Schneider, if he's interested.
I'm not interested.
I'm
But
not
thank you
interested.
very much.
Yeah.
I just want to sit in the back bench and make snide comments, but
Those would be Schneider comments. Actually, this year I have had a change in employment and change in ability to engage, and I would throw my hat into the ring if folks were willing.
Make a motion.
Yes, so I would nominate John Constantino as vice chair.
I just wanted to ask Denise if you're interested before we.
Honestly, I wasn't interested the first time, but I'm here at the pleasure of the governor to serve, and that's what I will do, title or no title. I'm a board member.
I'll
leave it at that.
Yeah, I would I mean, I appreciate the changes that have happened, and I think that's good for the board, but the representation now, I would prefer to have a more diverse leadership on our board. And I think Carl's term is, after 25 years or whatever, is as the chair, is probably coming to an end also, and we should, I mean, we got some big changes coming up. Pamela has said she might retire in the near term. I think new leadership is always appropriate on the board. And I would look for more significant changes next year, John, and commit to that. But at this point in time, I think we have it like CV salts in particular. It's going to move through a lot this year, and I'm interested in keeping this team. And I would suggest that we renominate Denise if she'll serve this year too.
Well, you suggested, is that a nomination or a suggestion?
I made a nomination.
Very good. So we have 2 nominations. Any further nominations?
So as was happened last year, if you know, I don't need to be the vice chair, but so it's up to the rest of the board to make that decision. I don't have any problem with the way Denise has handled things over her tenure. So you know, with that said, if she wants to serve, you know, I guess it's up to the I mean, I don't really want to put the board in a position to vote on the record and have a split vote or something, but that being said, I wasn't quite sure, Bob, what you meant by next year, more significant change. Does that mean you think there's a limit to the chairmanship and the vice chair should be prepared to move up, or I'm not sure where you were going?
I think that we reach that point, and often the person that has the training to take the chair job is the vice chair. And I think, how long have you done this, 2 years or a year? 2 years, I think another year. And then I would be prepared to really think about a significant change in the leadership. And I would, at that time, actually commit to being very supportive of your moving into the leadership roles. But that's just my thinking.
Any further discussion?
I mean, I know Denise, and I think she knows me, and I'm sure she didn't take it as a slight that I nominate John. I think that, John served, I think, as vice chair 1 year, and I think he was interested second year, but I think we went with Jenny Moffett because there was a lot of ag focused things that were coming up, and she felt like a good fit. John, I think, was limited before. I think he's certainly competent enough. I'm really impressed with the work that Denise has done this year. I don't think that we could go wrong with either one of these persons. So I'm really just willing to, well, I'll leave it right there. You guys know how I feel.
So, Bob, you actually bring up a really good point that whoever is in that position needs to, be ready to assume the title at some point. And I don't know that I can commit to being chairman a year from now. As I said, my employment changed, which means I'm my own employer. So there's a lot of time that goes into being chairman that I don't know that I can commit to. And if the board is thinking of a succession situation rather than sort of a vice chairman role or vice chairman role, then I'm certainly happy to be open that for discussion. But if that's where everybody's headed,
and let me say that I'm up for appointment this year. and I'm not going to, I found it's dangerous to make assumptions on whether you're appointed or not, or going to be reappointed or not, but I've been reappointed how many times? And but this will be the last time. If I want to live, because I know if I do it more than one more time, my wife will drown me or something.
Will she drown you in salt?
That's right, probably so.
I do want to emphasize.
And before I would leave, so let's say 4 years, before I'd leave, I'd like to take a backbench position. It's nice to be a backbencher. You can criticize and all kinds of things.
Should also say that Denise Kadara spends a lot of time as the vice chair, so it's not like it's a lot less work. I mean,
Right, right. And I think it's important today for a lot of things we do that both the chair and the vice chair are involved. So with that said, we've got 2 nominations. I don't know how we're going to vote this. If we do the roll and
Well, Carl, let me restate what I said. I will withdraw my nomination as it seems that there is a succession planning, longer-term approach to this position this time. So we'll make it easy.
well, thank you for that, John, and that's big of you. Any further discussion? Hearing none, call the roll, please.
Ms. Ramirez.
Wait, is there a second? Did somebody second?
Yeah, do I have a second? Good point. Yeah, we don't understand.
No, but you nominated John, so
Okay, well, if John, okay, I don't understand what she's saying. Saying that I nominated John, so he withdrew, so then I have to withdraw my nomination. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, you really don't need
Yeah.
a second in this.
well.
We're Sturgis, not Roberts. It's a whole different book that tells you how to run meetings.
I vote yes.
So, and again, just for the record, what I understand is that there's one nomination on the table for Denise Kadara, and I believe Dr. Longley, by asking for the roll call, was putting that nomination forward to a vote. It can be seconded. It doesn't have to be seconded, so it's at your pleasure. If anybody wants to second.
I'll second it.
And you'll vote.
okay. Ms. Ramirez.
Yes.
Mr. Schneider. Dr. Markham.
Aye.
Ms. Brower.
Yes, this is the most gracious board I've been on. You guys are pretty awesome.
Mr. Costantino.
Aye.
Ms. Kadara. Dr. Longley.
Yes.
Motion carries.
so Dr. Longley, just to be technically correct, there's no obligation under the Water Code for a vice chair. If the board wanted, you could have 2 vice chairs or 3 vice chairs. But, so that's not a formal position.
It's not in the
Now
water
you
code.
tell us. Now you tell us. I could have been like second vice chair for like 8 years already.
Well, we'll come up with but we don't want to call them vice chairs. We want to call them, there's a better term than vice chair.
You can borrow Dr. Susan F. Chair 1, Chair 2.
There we go. The meeting is adjourned until the March 9th meeting.
March 9th here, the CV Salts.
Yes.
It's a big milestone for the board, and I hope you all can make it.
Yep.
Thank you.